Imagine standing on the slopes of Mount Waryong on a crisp Tuesday morning in 1991. You are searching for salamander eggs, the sun warm on your neck as you move through the dry brush with your friends. Everything feels like a perfect holiday until you catch a sound that does not belong. It was not the wind in the pines or a distant bird. It was the rhythmic, hollow clink of a tin can hitting the stone, a sharp and deliberate sound coming from a place where the shadows are too thick to see. Tonight, I have 13 true stories about the moment that peace is shattered by things we cannot explain. We are looking at cases from the early 90s, a time when the world was changing and old shadows were finding new places to hide. You will hear the steady fall of rain and a low hum of white noise to help you settle in for the night. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, please subscribe and tell me where you are listening from. And for the like button, treat it like a suspicious tin can found on a mountain trail. Do not just kick it aside. Give it a firm, deliberate press to see what is inside. Now, turn the lights down and let us go back to Daegu. March 26th, 1991, was a rare Tuesday of total freedom for the children of Daegu, South Korea. It was a national holiday for the first local elections in 30 years, meaning the schools were closed and the adults were busy at the polling stations. The sun was bright, warming the red brick apartment complexes of the Seongseo district. 13-year-old Woo Cheol woke up early, feeling the quiet energy of a house without the usual school morning rush. He was the oldest of the group, a natural leader with a steady gaze and a quiet way of moving through the neighborhood. His friend, 12-year-old Jo Ho-yeon, lived nearby and was already thinking about the streams on Mount Waryong. Ho-yeon was energetic, the kind of boy who could not keep his sneakers clean for more than an hour. He loved the outdoors and the small treasures found under wet rocks. To him, a day off was a mission to be completed. He met up with 10-year-old Park Young-gyu, who was known for his quick smile and his ability to keep up with the older boys despite his smaller frame. They stood on the sidewalk, their shadows short in the morning light, waiting for the rest of the crew to emerge. Soon, 11-year-old Kim Nam-chan joined them. Nam-chan was the middle child of the group, often the one who mediated small arguments over which path to take or which game to play. He brought a sense of balance to the group, a boy who was careful with his words and observant of his surroundings. Finally, 9-year-old Kim Sung-hun arrived, the youngest and most eager to prove he belonged with the big kids. He was small for his age, with bright eyes that missed nothing. Together, these 5 boys formed a tight circle of friendship that was a constant feature of the Seongseo streets. The boys had a specific goal that morning. They wanted to find salamander eggs. In many retellings, it is said they were looking for frogs, but the local children knew better. The salamanders lived in the cool, shallow pools of the streams that ran down the slopes of Mount Waryong, just a short walk from their front doors. They gathered empty tin cans from behind a local shop, the metal clinking together as they stuffed them into their pockets. These cans were their specimen jars, the tools of their small, scientific expedition. They felt like explorers heading into a vast, uncharted wilderness. Mount Waryong was not a jagged, dangerous peak, but a gentle, sprawling hill covered in thick brush and pine trees. To the adults, it was a place for morning exercise or a quick hike to clear the head. To the boys, it was a kingdom. They knew the shortcuts through the tall grass and the hidden clearings where the sun hit the forest floor in golden patches. As they crossed the road and stepped onto the first dirt trail, the sounds of the city began to fade. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth, and the 5 boys disappeared into the green canopy, their voices echoing through the trees. The morning passed slowly for the parents in the valley below. At noon, Kim Sung-hun's mother was busy preparing a lunch of rice and vegetables, expecting her son to come bursting through the door at any moment. She looked at the clock, noting that it was a bit past their usual eating time, but she did not worry. It was a holiday, and she knew how the mountain could pull children into its rhythms. She imagined them sitting by a stream, splashing water on their faces and comparing the tiny, jelly-like eggs they had found. She set the table and waited for the sound of his footsteps. By 2 p.m, the silence in the apartment started to feel heavy. The polling stations were crowded, and the streets were filled with people in their Sunday best, but the boys had not returned for their midday meal. One by one, the parents began to step out onto their balconies, looking toward the mountain. They saw other hikers coming down the trails, middle-aged men in colorful vests and couples holding hands. They asked if anyone had seen 5 boys with tin cans. A few hikers nodded, mentioning they had seen a group of children near the midsection of the hill around noon, laughing and looking healthy. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the air on Mount Waryong turned sharp and cold. The golden light disappeared, replaced by long blue shadows that blurred the edges of the trees. The parents were no longer waiting on balconies. They were at the base of the trail, calling out names into the growing dark. Wu Cheo, Ho Yun, Youngyu, Namchan, Seunghun. Their voices were thin against the vast silence of the mountain. There was no answering shout, no sound of running sneakers on the dirt. The mountain, which had seemed so friendly just hours before, now looked like a wall of impenetrable black. By midnight, the local police station was a hive of frantic activity. The officers initially thought the boys had simply lost their way in the dark or decided to camp out as a prank. They sent a small team up with flashlights, the beams cutting through the mist. They searched the known streams and the common resting spots, but they found nothing. Not a single tin can, not a shoe, not a scrap of clothing. The disappearance of 5 children at once was unheard of, and as the first morning light hit the peak, the scale of the search began to explode into something the country had never seen. The South Korean government realized the gravity of the situation within 48 hours. President Roh Tae-woo issued a special order, diverting hundreds of thousands of police and military personnel to Daegu. Over 300,000 people eventually took part in the search. They moved in long, straight lines across the mountain, their shoulders touching, poking long sticks into the brush and looking for any sign of disturbed earth. Divers were sent into the cold waters of the nearby reservoirs, feeling through the silt at the bottom. It was the largest search for missing persons in the history of the nation. Millions of flyers were printed, showing the faces of the 5 boys. Their images were pasted on the sides of milk cartons, on the walls of subway stations, and on the back of every taxi in the city. Public service announcements interrupted television programs, and the entire country became obsessed with the Frog Boys. Every citizen became a volunteer investigator. Tunnels were dug under houses where psychics claimed the boys were being held. Every suspicious car was reported. Yet, despite the massive pressure and the millions of eyes watching, the trail remained completely cold for months, then years. The parents of the boys lived in a state of suspended animation. They quit their jobs and bought old trucks, covering them with parts. One father, Kim Cheol-gyu, spent his entire life savings on the search. He would sit at the base of Mount Waryong for hours, staring at the trees as if he could force them to give up their secret. The psychological toll was devastating. At one point, a criminal profiler accused the father of one of the boys of murdering them and hiding the bodies under his own floorboards. The police actually tore up the foundation of that family's home while the mother and father watched in horror. They found nothing but dirt and pipes. The accusation destroyed the family's reputation and added a layer of cruelty to their already unbearable grief. By the late 90s, the case had become a national mystery, a symbol of a search that was too big to fail but had produced nothing. People began to whisper about North Korean spies or secret government experiments. The mountain sat there, overlooking the city, a silent witness to a tragedy that seemed to have no ending and no evidence. On September 26, 2002, a man named Choi Huante was hiking on the side of Mount Waryong to gather acorns. He moved off the main path, pushing through a patch of thick brush in a ravine that was rarely visited. As he bent down to reach for a cluster of acorns, he saw something white poking through the soil and the rotting leaves. He brushed the dirt away, thinking it was a piece of trash, but the shape was too smooth, too curved. He realized he was looking at the top of a human skull. He backed away, his heart hammering against his ribs. The police arrived within the hour, cordoning off the area with yellow tape. As they carefully brushed away the layers of earth, they discovered a sight that froze everyone in attendance. All 5 boys were there, buried in a tight, overlapping cluster in a shallow grave. They were less than 2 kilometers from their homes, in an area that had supposedly been searched dozens of times by thousands of people. The remains were intertwined, as if they had been placed there with a grim, calculated efficiency. The discovery was not the relief the parents had prayed for. It was the beginning of a much darker reality. I noticed that even after 11 years in the soil, the boys were still wearing the clothes they had left home in on that holiday morning. The fabric was tattered and stained by the earth, but the colors of their jackets and the sturdy rubber of their sneakers were still recognizable. It was a detail that made the passage of time feel incredibly short, as if the boys had only just stepped into the woods. The mountain had held them in a cold, damp embrace, preserving the evidence of their final moments while the rest of the world moved on and grew old around them. Initial reports from the police suggested the boys had simply died of hypothermia. They claimed the children had become lost in the dark, huddled together for warmth, and succumbed to the freezing night air. But the parents refused to accept this. They knew their sons. They knew the boys were familiar with the mountain and could have walked back to the lights of the city in 20 minutes from almost any point. When the forensic experts from Gyeongsang National University took over the examination, the hypothermia theory collapsed instantly. The bones told a much more violent and intentional story of what had happened. The forensic team found that 3 of the skulls had been struck with a blunt object. These were not the marks of a fall or a random accident. The indentations were precise and repetitive, suggesting a tool like a hammer or a small, heavy pick. One of the skulls had several holes that looked like they had been made by a pointed instrument. Furthermore, one boy had a hole in his skull that looked suspiciously like a gunshot wound from a small-caliber weapon or a high-powered air rifle. The boys had not been lost. They had been cornered and systematically murdered in the ravine. The investigation shifted from a search to a cold case homicide. Detectives began to look for anyone who might have had a reason to be on that specific part of the mountain with a weapon. There was a military shooting range nearby, and for a time, investigators wondered if a stray bullet had struck one of the boys, leading a panicked soldier to kill the witnesses and bury the bodies. But the markings on the skulls did not match military equipment. They looked like the work of someone using a hand tool, perhaps someone who worked in the woods or lived on the fringes of the local community. The way the bodies were buried suggested the killer was someone who knew how to hide things quickly. The grave was shallow, but it was located in a natural depression that collected leaves and debris, making it invisible to the casual observer. The killer had stripped the boys of some of their outer clothing, perhaps to make the burial easier or to keep as trophies. The precision of the strikes to the heads indicated a high level of rage or a cold, practiced hand. Yet, despite the new forensic evidence and the fresh investigation, no suspects were ever officially named or brought to trial. By 2006, the statute of limitations for the murders of the Frog Boys expired under South Korean law at the time. This meant that even if the killer walked into a police station and confessed, they could no longer be prosecuted for the crime. The law was later changed due to public outcry over this specific case, but it was too late for the boys from Daegu. The case officially went cold, a permanent scar on the national consciousness. The parents were left with the knowledge that the person who ended their sons' lives was likely still walking the same streets. 35 years after those 5 boys disappeared into the pines of Mount Waryong, the memory of the Frog Boys is preserved in a somber monument at the base of Mount Waryong. It is a stone structure shaped like 5 overlapping circles, representing the bond of the friends who died together. People still visit the site, leaving small toys, candy, and tin cans filled with water. The mountain has changed. New apartment buildings have encroached on the lower slopes, and the trails are now paved and lit at night. But for the families who remain, the mountain is still a place of profound absence, a landscape defined by the 5 voices that never came home. The father of Kim Sung-hun still lives in the same district, often looking up at the ridge as the sun sets. He does not look for salamanders anymore, and he does not expect a knock on the door. He simply exists in the aftermath of a holiday that never truly ended. The killer's identity remains a shadow, a ghost that was never caught by the 300,000 men who walked right over the grave. The silence of the mountain is no longer peaceful. It is heavy with the weight of the things that stay buried until it is far too late. The boys of Daegu vanished into the earth, leaving behind only the cold metal of their specimen cans and the memory of a Tuesday morning. But while their story ended in the quiet of a mountain ravine, other stories were beginning in the crowded, humid streets of Mumbai. There, the earth was not used to hide the victims, but as a weapon itself. The pavement stones that millions of people walked over every day were about to become instruments of a silent, crushing terror. We move now from the slopes of Mount Waryong to the shadows of the Sion district. June 10th, 1990. The monsoon rains were just beginning to turn the dust of Mumbai into a thick black sludge. Abbas sat on the edge of a concrete curb in the Sion district, wiping the sweat from his forehead with a tattered cloth. He was 32 years old, a man of quiet habits and strong hands, who had come to the city from a small village in the north to find a way to support his family. Abbas worked at the docks, lifting heavy crates of spice and machinery until his back felt like it was made of dry glass. He did not have a room or a bed. Like thousands of others in the city, his home was a specific stretch of pavement under the massive concrete belly of a flyover. He liked this spot because it was slightly elevated, keeping him dry when the gutters overflowed. He had a small wooden box where he kept a spare shirt, a photo of his wife, and a tin of tea leaves. Every evening, Abbas followed the same rhythm. He would buy a single cup of tea from a roadside vendor, sipping it slowly while watching the stream of cars go by. He was a shadow in the bright lights of the metropolis, a person who existed in the margins but felt a strange sense of ownership over his few square feet of stone. He knew the other men who slept nearby, the day laborers, the beggars, and the elderly men with nowhere else to go. They were a community of the displaced, bound by the shared hardness of the ground. He spent his nights dreaming of the day he would return to his village with enough money to buy a small plot of land. He calculated his savings in his head, counting every rupee earned from the back-breaking labor at the port. To Abbas, the city was a machine that traded his physical strength for a future he could almost touch. He slept deeply despite the roar of the trucks overhead, his body craving the rest that only the cool, midnight air could provide. The other men on the pavement talked about the heat and the price of grain, but lately, a new topic had begun to surface in their low-voiced conversations. There were rumors of a bad wind blowing through the Matunga and Sion areas. A man 3 blocks away had been found dead on his mat, his face unrecognizable. The police had moved the body quickly, and the local papers barely mentioned it. Death was common on the streets of Mumbai, usually brought by disease or the crushing exhaustion of poverty. A boss noticed that the older men were starting to sleep in pairs, or moving their mats closer to the bright lights of the petrol stations. He didn't think much of it at first. He was young and strong, and he kept a heavy iron rod tucked into his bedroll just in case of thieves. He believed that as long as he stayed in his spot and minded his own business, the city would leave him alone. He was a man who trusted the solid, unchanging nature of the concrete beneath him. On the night of June 12th, the humidity was so thick it felt like breathing through wet wool. Abbas laid out his burlap sack, smoothing the wrinkles with his palms. He looked at the man sleeping 6 feet away, a quiet, elderly beggar named Ravi who always shared his tobacco. Ravi was already snoring, his head resting on a folded piece of cardboard. Abbas closed his eyes, listening to the rhythmic hum of the city, waiting for the exhaustion to pull him into a dreamless sleep. He woke up once in the early hours of the morning, disturbed by a sound that did not belong to the traffic. It was a heavy, wet thud, followed by the sound of something large being dragged across the grid of the road. Abbas stayed still, his hand inching toward the iron rod, but the sound did not repeat. He looked toward Ravi, but the elderly man was just a dark shape in the shadows. Abbas convinced himself it was just a stray dog or a piece of debris falling from a truck. The next morning, the sun rose over a scene that would change the atmosphere of Mumbai for an entire year. A police constable named Sawant was doing his early rounds when he stopped near the Matunga flyover. He saw a man lying on a mat, but there was something wrong with the geometry of the scene. Where the man's head should have been, there was a massive, rectangular slab of stone. It was a piece of the city itself, a heavy pavement stone that had been ripped from the ground nearby. Constable Sawant stepped closer, his boots crunching on broken glass. He realized that the stone was not just resting on the victim. It had been used as a weapon of incredible violence. The weight of the object was immense, likely 30 kilograms or more. There was no sign of a struggle, no scattered belongings, and no blood spray on the surrounding area. The act had been silent, efficient, and horrifyingly deliberate. The victim was Ravi, the man who had shared tobacco with Abbas just hours before. The news spread through the homeless community like a fever. They began to call the killer the Stoneman. Abbas stood at the edge of the police cordons, his chest tight with a fear he had never known. He looked at the spot where Ravi had slept, now a dark stain on the gray concrete. He realized that the sound he had heard in the night was the sound of a human life being extinguished by a piece of the road. The safety he felt in his routine was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp alertness. The investigation was a nightmare for the Mumbai police. There were no witnesses because the killer operated in the dead of night, targeting those who lived in the deepest shadows. There were no fingerprints on the stones, which were often found wiped clean by the heavy monsoon rain. The victims were always lone sleepers, people with no families to demand justice and no permanent addresses to track. To the police, it felt like they were hunting a ghost that could move heavy masonry without making a sound. I find it striking that in a city of millions, the killer managed to find the exact moments of total isolation. He did not strike in the crowded slums where people lived shoulder to shoulder. He chose the lonely stretches of road where a scream would be swallowed by the wind. It was as if he was mapping the loneliness of the city, identifying the people who had the least protection and the fewest eyes on them. He was a predator of the invisible, using the city's own architecture to destroy its most vulnerable residents. Constable Sawant spent his nights patrolling the flyovers, his flashlight beam darting into the alcoves and under the bridges. He found that the homeless population had begun to change their habits. They were no longer sleeping in the dark. They gathered in groups of 20 or 30, sleeping in tight circles with one man always standing watch. The city was on edge, and every pile of construction material or loose paving stone became a source of terror for those with nowhere else to go. By August, the body count had risen to 10. Each crime scene was an exact replica of the first. A lone sleeper, a massive stone, and a complete lack of evidence. The police began to notice a terrifying detail. The stones were not just dropped, they were placed with a strange, ritualistic precision. Sometimes, the killer would leave the stone perfectly centered over the victim's chest or head, as if he were pinning them to the earth. There was no robbery involved. The victim's few coins and possessions were always left untouched. The twist in the investigation came when a detective realized that these murders were not unique to Mumbai. A year earlier, in 1989, a similar series of stone killings had terrorized the city of Calcutta, over 1,000 miles away. 13 people had died there in the exact same manner before the murders abruptly stopped. The police began to wonder if the killer was a traveler, someone who moved across the vast rail network of India, carrying a dark compulsion from one metropolis to the next. Abbas decided he could no longer sleep under the flyover. He moved to a crowded shelter near the railway station, paying a small fee to sleep on a floor with 100 other men. He was safe from the Stoneman there, but he lost the quiet and the sense of home he had built on the pavement. He watched the news every day, hoping for an arrest, but the reports only grew more frequent. The killer seemed to be mocking the police, striking just blocks away from their temporary checkpoints. The climax of the fear occurred on a Tuesday in October. A witness, a taxi driver who had stopped to change a tire, claimed to have seen a figure moving near a sleeping man under the Sion Bridge. He described a man of average height, wearing dark, grease-stained clothes, carrying something heavy in his arms like it was a small child. When the driver shouted, the figure did not run. It simply stepped back into the darkness of a nearby alley and vanished. By the time the driver reached the spot, the victim was already gone. The police flooded the Sion district within minutes, cordoning off every exit. They searched every basement, every parked truck, and every drainage pipe. They found dozens of men hiding in the shadows, but none of them matched the description of the man with the heavy burden. The Stoneman had slipped through the net again. It was the last time anyone would claim to see him. As the year 1990 drew to a close, the murders in Mumbai stopped as suddenly as they had begun. The truth behind the Stoneman remains a void in the history of Indian criminology. Some believe the killer was a mentally ill individual who saw the homeless as a blight to be removed. Others suggested it was a practitioner of a dark ritual, believing that crushing a life under stone would grant them strength or longevity. Because no one was ever caught, the motives remain purely speculative, a collection of theories left to gather dust in the cold case files of the Mumbai Police Department. The killer profile suggested a man of extraordinary physical power. To lift a 30-kilogram stone and place it with such silence and precision required not just strength, but a terrifying level of control. He was likely someone who worked in construction or manual labor, someone whose presence in the industrial areas of the city would never be questioned. He was a man who knew the rhythm of the city's heart, knowing exactly when the police shifted their patrols and when the traffic was loudest. The legal outcome of the case was a stalemate. Several suspects were detained over the years, including a man in 1996 who claimed to have knowledge of the crimes, but no physical evidence ever linked them to the scenes. The case remains officially unsolved. The files are still open, but they are rarely touched, as the witnesses have disappeared into the vast population of India, and the physical evidence has long since been lost or contaminated by the passage of decades. On the bustling, well-lit sidewalks of modern Mumbai today, the areas of Sion and Matunga have been transformed. The old flyovers have been reinforced, and bright LED streetlights now illuminate every corner of the pavement. The homeless population still exists, but the Stoneman has passed into the realm of urban legend, a a story told to newcomers to warn them of the dangers of sleeping alone in the dark. Modern forensic technology, such as facial recognition and ubiquitous surveillance cameras, would likely have caught the killer within days in the present era. Abbas eventually saved enough money to leave the city. He returned to his village in 1992, never looking back at the skyline of Mumbai. He built his house, but his neighbors noticed that he never used stone for the foundation. He insisted on poured concrete and heavy timber. He still wakes up in the middle of the night if he hears a heavy thud outside, his hand reaching for a light that wasn't there 36 years ago. The city took his youth, and the Stoneman took his peace. The weight of the stone was a physical terror, a material nightmare that defined a year of blood in Mumbai. But in the clean, cold streets of Stockholm, a different kind of weapon was being prepared. It was not heavy, and it did not require great strength to use. It was a weapon of light, a thin, red beam that could reach out from the darkness and mark a person for death before they even heard the click of a trigger. We move now from the weight of the earth to the precision of the laser. August 3rd, 1991. Gärdet, Stockholm. A young student named Shahryar Bahari was walking through a quiet park toward the subway. The air was cool for a summer night, carrying the scent of mown grass and the distant salt of the Baltic Sea. He was heading home after a long day of classes, his mind filled with the small, peaceful details of his coming weekend. He did not hear a car, or a footstep, or any sign of another person. Shahryar was a diligent student who moved to Sweden to build a life in a country known for its openness and safety. He spent his days in the university library, surrounded by the smell of old paper and the quiet scratching of pens. He was a young man who believed in the promise of the North, working late hours to master a new language and a new culture. His life was a series of quiet, steady steps toward a future that felt bright and certain. As he reached the edge of the park, Shahryar noticed a small, flickering red light dancing on his jacket. It was a tiny dot, no larger than a ladybug, moving rhythmically across his chest. He looked around, thinking it was a reflection from a passing car or a child playing with a toy. The dot was steady, bright, and silent. He stopped walking, puzzled by the strange light that seemed to follow his every movement in the gathering twilight of the Stockholm evening. Jimmy Ranjbar was another young man who shared this sense of hope. He was 25 years old, an Iranian immigrant who had come to Stockholm to study at the Royal Institute of Technology. Jimmy was known among his friends for his soft voice and his deep love for engineering. He lived in a modest apartment, filled with technical manuals and photos of his family back in Tehran. He was the kind of person who always remembered his neighbors' birthdays and never missed a morning lecture. Jimmy's daily routine was a clockwork of ambition. He would wake up early, brew a pot of strong tea, and walk the same path to the university buildings. He loved the structure of his life in Sweden, the way the trains arrived on time and the way the city felt organized and logical. To Jimmy, Stockholm was not just a city, it was a sanctuary where a person could be judged on their merit rather than their origin. He felt a deep, quiet gratitude for the peace of his new home. On the evening of November 8th, 1991, Jimmy was walking near the university library. The first frost of the year had turned the sidewalks into glittering ribbons of ice. He was bundled in a heavy wool coat, his scarf pulled high against the biting wind. He was thinking about a complex calculus problem, his head down, his breath forming small clouds of steam in the air. He was just a few hundred yards from the safety of the campus entrance when the world changed. A small red dot appeared on the back of Jimmy's neck. It was the same silent, dancing light that had visited Shahryar months earlier. Jimmy did not see it. He continued walking, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. The light was precise, holding its position even as he moved through the shadows of the tall university buildings. It was a pinpoint of artificial brilliance in the natural darkness of the Swedish winter. A moment later, a sharp crack echoed through the empty street. Jimmy collapsed onto the ice, his technical drawings spilling from his bag and scattering in the wind. There was no one around to hear his call for help. The red dot vanished instantly, leaving the street in its original, cold silence. He lay there for a long time, the white snow beneath him slowly turning a deep, dark crimson. He was found by a passing security guard who initially thought the young man had simply slipped on the ice. The reality was much more focused and much more sinister. Jimmy Ranjbar was rushed to the hospital, where surgeons worked for hours to save him. He had been shot from a distance with a high-powered rifle. The bullet had caused catastrophic damage, and despite the best efforts of the medical team, Jimmy died the following day. He became the only fatality in a string of attacks that had begun to paralyze the city. The Swedish public, usually calm and reserved, felt a rising tide of panic as the news of the laser man began to spread. The Stockholm Police Department formed a special task force led by Detective Stefan Bergqvist. They were dealing with a ghost who struck from the shadows and left no shell casings behind. The only common thread was the red dot and the fact that every victim was an immigrant. The city was suddenly a place of fear for anyone with dark hair or a foreign accent. People stopped walking alone at night, and the immigrant communities organized their own patrols to protect their neighborhoods. The investigation was a slow, grinding process of elimination. Detectives spent weeks interviewing survivors, looking for any detail that could break the case. One survivor mentioned seeing a man on a white bicycle fleeing the scene of a shooting in the Gerdet district. Another mentioned a man with strikingly blonde hair and bright blue eyes who seemed to be watching the subway entrances. These small, scattered details began to form a picture of a predator who was as organized as he was elusive. Detective Bergqvist noticed a strange pattern in the police logs. Every time there was a shooting, there was a bank robbery in a nearby district a few days later. The robber was always described as a man on a bicycle, wearing a wig and carrying a heavy bag. The police began to wonder if the shootings and the robberies were connected by more than just timing. They started to look for a man who was not just a killer, but a gambler who needed a constant stream of cash to fund a secret life. The task force began cross-referencing lists of bank robbery suspects with people who had recently purchased specialized hunting equipment. They found a name that kept appearing in different contexts: John Ausonius. He was a man with a history of violent outbursts and a strange obsession with his own appearance. He had changed his name from Wolfgang Zog to something that sounded more traditionally Swedish. He was a frequent visitor to high-stakes gambling dens and was known for losing large sums of money. The twist in the investigation came when the police looked into John Ausonius's family history. They discovered that the man who was hunting immigrants was, in fact, the son of immigrants himself. His father was Swiss, and his mother was German. He had been born with dark hair and dark eyes, but he had spent his entire life trying to erase his heritage. He had used chemical dyes to turn his hair a bright, artificial blonde and wore blue contact lenses to hide his natural eye color. John Ausonius suffered from a profound, violent self-loathing. He had been bullied as a child for his foreign appearance, and as he grew older, he turned that pain outward. He began to believe that by attacking other immigrants, he could prove his own Swedishness to a society he felt rejected by. He was a man living a double life, pretending to be a successful businessman while spending his nights cowering in the shadows with a rifle, waiting for a target that reminded him of himself. The investigation reached its climax in June 1992. The police had placed Ausonius under 24-hour surveillance. They watched as he prepared for another bank robbery in central Stockholm. He was meticulous, checking his bicycle tires and adjusting his disguise in a handheld mirror. The detectives followed him at a distance, their hearts racing as he approached the bank. They waited for the exact moment he stepped out with the stolen money, and then they moved in. Ausonius was tackled to the pavement just yards from his bicycle. He fought with a desperate animal strength, but he was quickly overwhelmed. In his bag, the police found a handgun and a wig. A later search of his apartment revealed a long-range rifle fitted with a sophisticated laser sight. The red dot that had haunted the streets of Stockholm was finally extinguished. The man who wanted to be the ultimate Swede was led away in handcuffs, his blue contacts sliding out of place. I think about the peculiar irony of a man who spent his life trying to blend into a background of blonde hair and blue eyes, only to be caught because he stood out as too perfect, too artificial. He tried to build a monument to his own identity using the lives of others as bricks, but in the end, he was just a man with a bottle of hair dye and a stolen bicycle. The precision he craved in his kills was a reflection of the control he lacked in his own fractured and self-hating mind. The trial of John Ausonius was a national event. He was defiant in the courtroom, often arguing with the judge and showing no remorse for the life of Jimmy Ranjbar or the 10 others he had wounded. He spoke of his actions as if they were a political necessity, a way to save the country from an imaginary threat. The psychological reports described him as a narcissist with a severe personality disorder, a man who could not reconcile his own reality with the world around him. In 1994, John Ausonius was sentenced to life in prison. He was convicted of 1 murder, 10 attempted murders, and a string of aggravated bank robberies. The Laserman case led to a deep national conversation in Sweden about integration, racism, and the hidden psychological scars of immigration. It remains one of the most studied cases in Swedish criminal history, a dark landmark that forced a peaceful society to look at the shadows growing in its own backyard. Deep into the 21st century, the streets of Stockholm, John Ausonius remains incarcerated in a high-security facility in Sweden. He is now an old man, his once blonde hair long since turned gray. He has made several applications for a fixed-term sentence, but they have all been denied due to his continued lack of empathy and the high risk of recidivism. He is a relic of a violent era, a man who remains a prisoner not just of the state, but of the self-loathing that drove him to the streets in 1991. The streets of Stockholm are quiet again, and the memory of the red dot has faded into the history books. Jimmy Ranjbar's name is etched on a small plaque at the university, a reminder of a life that was taken just as it was beginning to flourish. The city has moved on, but the lesson remains. The most dangerous predators are often those who are trying the hardest to look like everyone else. The red light is gone, but the cold silence of the Swedish winter still holds the memory. The precision of the laser was a clean, modern kind of violence, a mark of light that promised a quick and clinical end. But as we move from the cold air of Stockholm to the sterile corridors of Mexico City, we find a different kind of precision. There, the weapon was not a rifle, but a needle. The killer was not a man hiding in the woods, but a man in a white coat, moving through the halls of a hospital. We shift now from the light of the laser to the silence of the syringe. September 14th, 1991. Mexico City. Dr. Noe Ramirez walked down the hallway of a small private medical clinic in the Roma district. The floors were polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the fluorescent lights above. He adjusted his stethoscope, the metal cold against his neck, and checked the chart for room 412. In that room sat Adela, a woman of 72 years who still wore her silver hair in a neat, tight bun. She had spent 40 years teaching mathematics to children in the city, and she still corrected the grammar of the nurses who brought her water. Adela was recovering from a minor surgery, but her heart was tired, and she often complained about the noise in the ward. Adela missed her small apartment on the 3rd floor, where the balcony was filled with terracotta pots of red geraniums. She worried about who was watering them while she was away. She told everyone who would listen about her grandson, who was studying to be an architect, and how he promised to build her a house with a garden that never needed rain. She was a woman of sharp opinions and a loud laugh, the kind of patient who made the staff work a little harder. Adela knew exactly when her medication was due, and would point to her watch if the nurse was 5 minutes late. To some, she was a favorite. To others, she was a burden who took up too much time in a facility that valued speed and silence. Dr. Noe Ramirez entered the room with a soft, practiced smile. He was a young man, barely 30, with a reputation for being remarkably calm under pressure. He spoke in a low, soothing voice that made the patients feel like they were in the best possible hands. He pulled the curtain shut, creating a small, private world within the white walls of the clinic. Adela looked up at him, her eyes still bright despite the fatigue. She asked when she could go home to her flowers. Ramirez patted her hand, his touch light and professional. He told her that she needed one more small treatment to help her heart find its rhythm. He reached into the deep pocket of his lab coat and pulled out a small, clear glass vial and a syringe. He moved with a clinical grace that was almost beautiful to watch. He drew the liquid into the needle, his hands steady, his expression completely blank. Adela watched him, trusting the white coat and the title. She felt a small pinch in her arm, a momentary discomfort that she had grown used to. Ramirez stayed by her side, watching the monitor as the green line began to change. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor slowed down, the gaps between the sounds stretching longer and longer. Adela felt a sudden, heavy coldness spreading from her arm toward her chest. She tried to speak, to ask why her breath felt like it was moving through sand, but her tongue would not obey. She looked at Ramirez, but he was no longer smiling. He was just observing. Within minutes, the green line on the screen went flat, and a single, high-pitched tone filled the small room. Ramirez did not call for the crash cart. He did not yell for the nurses. He waited for exactly 60 seconds, his eyes fixed on the display. Then, he calmly walked to the door, opened the curtain, and announced to the hallway that Adela had suffered a sudden respiratory failure. This was the fourth such death in the clinic in less than 2 months. Each time, the victim was an elderly patient who required significant attention or had a slow recovery path. The hospital administration viewed these as unfortunate but expected losses given the age of the patients. Death in a clinic was a statistic, and Dr. Ramirez was very good at managing the paperwork. Elena was a nurse who had worked at the clinic for 10 years. She was a woman who noticed the small things, the way a patient's breathing changed when they were sleeping, or the exact level of fluid in an IV bag. She liked the order of her job, but she began to feel a cold knot of dread in her stomach every time she saw Dr. Ramirez heading toward the long-term recovery ward. She began to keep her own private log in a small blue notebook. She recorded the time of death, the attending physician, and the state of the patient just an hour before they passed away. Elena noticed that Adela had been joking about her flowers just 30 minutes before her heart stopped. There was no medical reason for a woman in her condition to fail so completely and so fast. Elena noticed another detail that haunted her. After every sudden death on the shift of Ramirez, the supply room was short on vials of potassium chloride. This was a common chemical used in hospitals, but it was highly dangerous if not diluted properly. In its concentrated form, it could stop a human heart almost instantly. She realized that the mercy being shown was actually an execution. One evening, while Ramirez was busy with a new admission, Elena slipped into his private office. Her hands shook as she looked through the trash bin and the drawers of his desk. She found a discarded glass vial that had been wiped clean, but a small amount of liquid remained at the bottom. She tucked it into her pocket, her heart racing against her ribs like a trapped bird. She took the vial to a friend who worked in a forensic lab across the city. She did not give a name. She just asked for a chemical analysis. 2 days later, the answer came back. It was undiluted potassium chloride. Elena knew she could not go to the hospital board. They were more concerned with the clinic's reputation. She went directly to the city police instead. The investigators were skeptical at first. They told Elena that doctors were under immense stress and that patients in clinics often died. But Elena was persistent. She showed them her blue notebook, pointing out the mathematical impossibility of the death rate during the hours of Ramirez. She described the God complex she saw in his eyes, a man who thought he was tidying up a system. The police began a quiet surveillance of the clinic. They tracked the movements of Ramirez, noting how he avoided the more experienced nurses and preferred to do his rounds alone in the early hours of the morning. They watched as he grew more confident, his mercy killings happening more frequently as he became convinced that he was untouchable within the walls of the facility. The arrest happened on a Tuesday in November. The police moved in just as Ramirez was preparing a syringe for another difficult patient. They caught him in the hallway, the clear liquid still visible in the needle. He did not struggle or shout. He looked at the officers with a calm, analytical expression, as if they were a minor complication in a procedure he was trying to finish. I find it chilling that even during his interrogation, Ramirez spoke about his victims as if they were broken machines that were no longer worth the cost of repair. He did not use the language of a killer. He used the language of an administrator. He truly believed that by removing the elderly, he was making the healthcare system more efficient for those who could still work. The search of his home revealed a collection of medical journals with sections highlighted regarding resource management. He had spent years obsessing over the idea of a perfect, streamlined society where only the productive were allowed to survive. He viewed himself not as a murderer, but as a pioneer of a new, more logical way of managing the cycles of human life and death. The trial in Mexico City was a revelation of how easily a predator can hide in plain sight. Ramirez was convicted of multiple counts of murder, though the true number of his victims is believed to be much higher than the official record. The case exposed a massive lack of oversight in private clinics, where doctors were often given total autonomy over medication and care. The families of the victims, including the grandson of Adela, sat in the front row of the courtroom every day. They listened to the clinical descriptions of how the hearts of their loved ones were stopped by a man they had trusted. The architect grandson never built that house with the garden for his grandmother. Instead, he designed a simple headstone with an engraving of a geranium. Noe Ramirez was sentenced to 50 years in prison, the maximum allowed at the time. His medical license was revoked forever, and he was banned from ever entering a medical facility again. The Doctor of Death became a dark legend in the Mexican legal system, a warning of the darkness that can exist behind a polite smile and a professional title in a place of supposed healing. Looking back from the vantage point of the present day, Noe Ramirez remains behind bars in a high-security prison on the outskirts of Mexico City. He is now an elderly man himself, the very kind of person he once deemed disposable. His health is reportedly failing, but he is kept alive by the same medical system he tried to subvert. He has never expressed remorse, maintaining that he was simply helping the world move faster. Mexican medical laws were fundamentally changed because of this case. Private clinics are subject to random audits of their pharmacy supplies, and any sudden death must be reviewed by an independent medical examiner. The sterile corridors are safer now, but the families of those lost to the syringe still carry the heavy silence of that sterile room in the Roma district. The clear liquid in the syringe was a tool of ultimate control, a way to turn the heart off with the push of a thumb. But as we move from the sterile, white halls of Mexico to the suburban streets of Ontario, we find a different kind of control. It was not a medical necessity, but a shared obsession between two people. We move now from the silence of the clinic to the weight of concrete. June 15th, 1991. Burlington, Ontario. Leslie Mahaffy stood on her front porch, her fingers hovering over the doorbell. The air was thick and humid, typical for a southern Ontario summer night. The street was quiet, lined with well-kept lawns and dark windows. She was 14 years old, and the only sound was the distant hum of a cricket in the bushes. Leslie was the kind of teenager who filled a house with sound. She was a competitive figure skater, spending hours at the rink where the cold air felt sharp against her skin. When she wasn't on the ice, she was often in her room, listening to rock music and talking to her friends on a corded phone. She had a bright, rebellious energy that drew people toward her. Her bedroom was a sanctuary of posters and organized clutter. She had a collection of stuffed animals and a desk where she scribbled in her journals. Her mother, Debbie, remembered how Leslie would often leave her shoes in the middle of the hallway, a small sign of a life lived in a hurry. She was at that age where the world was starting to feel large and full of possibilities. That Saturday had been a heavy day. Leslie had attended the funeral of a friend who had died in a car accident. The weight of the service stayed with her as the sun went down. She went to a small gathering at a friend's house later that evening, looking for a way to shake off the sadness. She stayed out later than she was supposed to, losing track of the time. When she finally walked back to her house on French Drive, it was nearly 2 a.m. She tried the front door, but the lock was engaged. Her parents had a rule about the curfew, and they had followed through with their promise to lock the door if she was late. Leslie sat on the porch steps, looking at the dark street, wondering if she should wake them up or find another way in. She walked around to the back of the house, checking the windows and the sliding glass door. Everything was secure. The grass was wet with dew, soaking through her socks. She felt a mix of frustration and a small, lingering fear of the dark. The neighborhood was safe, but the silence of the middle of the night felt heavy. She returned to the front, sitting under the porch light. A car turned onto the street, its headlights cutting through the darkness. It was a light-colored sedan, moving slowly, as if the driver was looking for a specific address. Leslie watched it approach, her posture tensing slightly. The car pulled over to the curb directly in front of her house. The engine idled with a soft, mechanical purr that seemed to fill the quiet suburban air. The passenger window rolled down. A woman with long blonde hair leaned out, her face illuminated by the car's interior light. She looked friendly, almost like a college student. She asked Leslie if she was okay and if she needed help. A man sat in the driver's seat, his hands resting casually on the steering wheel. He had a clean-cut look, with a confident smile that matched the woman's. The couple introduced themselves as Paul and Carla. They spoke in soft, reassuring tones, telling Leslie that they were just driving through the area. They noticed she looked distressed and offered her a ride or the use of a phone. Leslie hesitated, but the presence of the woman made the situation feel less threatening. The couple seemed like a perfect pair, the kind of people who belonged in a magazine. The interaction lasted only a few minutes. To anyone watching from a window, it would have looked like a group of neighbors having a late-night conversation. There was no shouting and no obvious struggle. The car door opened, and Leslie stepped inside, closing the door behind her. The sedan pulled away from the curb, its red taillights fading as it turned the corner and disappeared into the night. The next morning, Debbie Mahaffy walked into Leslie's room to wake her for breakfast. The bed was empty and perfectly made. She checked the bathroom and the kitchen, calling her daughter's name, but the house remained silent. She found Leslie's shoes near the back door, but the girl was nowhere to be found. A cold, sharp panic began to settle in the pit of her stomach as she dialed the police. 2 weeks passed with no word and no leads. Then, a fisherman at Lake Gibson noticed something strange in the shallow water near the shore. Several large rectangular blocks of concrete were sitting on the muddy bottom. They looked out of place in the natural environment. He called the local authorities, thinking someone had been dumping construction waste into the protected waters. When the police pulled the blocks from the water, they realized the weight was wrong. The concrete was jagged and crudely poured. As the forensic teams began to break the blocks apart in a controlled laboratory setting, they found heavy plastic bags embedded inside. Within the layers of gray stone, they discovered the remains of Leslie Mahaffy. The community of Burlington was plunged into a state of shock. The investigation was led by a task force that examined every detail of the concrete. They found small traces of pink insulation and specific types of wood fibers mixed into the mix. This suggested the concrete had been poured in a residential basement or a garage. Detectives began a massive search for similar crimes, looking for a predator who operated with this level of cold, methodical planning. At the same time, police in the nearby city of Scarborough were hunting a serial rapist who had been active for years. This individual was known for his arrogance and his habit of talking to his victims. He had been dubbed the Scarborough Rapper. One detective began to wonder if the killer of Leslie Mahaffy and the rapist were the same person. They started looking for men who owned light-colored cars. A tip came in about a man named Paul Bernardo. He lived in a bright yellow house in Street Catharines with his wife, Carla Homolka. Neighbors described them as the perfect couple, often seen working in their yard or walking their dog. Paul was an accountant, and Carla worked at a veterinary clinic. They were young, attractive, and seemingly successful. The police began a quiet surveillance of the house on Louth Street. Detectives noticed that Paul was extremely careful about his routine. He seemed to sense when he was being watched, often taking long, winding routes home. However, his past was catching up to him. DNA technology was in its early stages, but investigators managed to obtain a sample from a discarded item. The results linked Paul Bernardo directly to the crimes of the Scarborough Rapper. The pieces were locking together. The arrest of Paul Bernardo in February 1993 sent shockwaves through Canada, but the real twist came during the interrogation of Carla Homolka. She presented herself as a victim, claiming that Paul had forced her to participate in his crimes through violence and intimidation. She offered to testify against him in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her lawyers negotiated what was called a deal with the devil. As part of the deal, Carla led investigators to a hidden compartment in the ceiling of their home. Inside, they found a collection of videotapes. These tapes were not evidence of Carla's victimization. They showed the couple working together as a team, laughing and talking while they committed unspeakable acts against Leslie Mahaffy and others. Carla was not a bystander. She was an active and willing participant. The tapes revealed a dynamic that was far more disturbing than a lone predator. It was a shared psychosis, a marriage built on the hunting and destruction of others. The tapes showed the interior of the Yellow House, a place that looked normal from the outside but was a chamber of horrors within. The pink insulation found in the concrete was visible in the background of the basement where they had worked. The climax of the case was the realization that the justice system had been played. By the time the tapes were discovered and viewed, the deal with Carla Homolka was already legally binding. She would only serve 12 years for her role in the deaths. The public watched in fury as the trial of Paul Bernardo began, the evidence from the tapes proving his direct involvement in the kidnapping and murder of Leslie. Paul Bernardo sat in the courtroom with the same confident, arrogant smile he had used on the night he met Leslie. He seemed to enjoy the attention, often looking at the gallery as if he were a celebrity. The defense tried to argue that he was a victim of his own compulsions, but the video evidence was undeniable. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. The truth of what happened in the house on Louth Street was a narrative of absolute betrayal. Leslie had been kept in a small, dark room for days. The couple had used her as a prop in their own dark fantasies, recording her suffering as if it were a home movie. When they were finished, they killed her and used the concrete to hide the evidence, believing that the weight of the stone would keep their secrets at the bottom of the lake. Paul was the architect of the violence, driven by a need for total dominance and a complete lack of empathy. He viewed his victims as objects to be used and discarded. Carla provided the cover of normalcy, the friendly face that lowered the guard of their targets. Together, they were a predatory unit that exploited the safety of suburban life to find their victims in the most ordinary of places. Paul Bernardo was diagnosed as a psychopathic narcissist, a man who derived pleasure from the fear of others. He was highly organized and possessed a high level of intelligence that he used to evade capture for years. Carla Homolka's profile was more complex, showing a woman who was willing to trade the lives of others for her own comfort, a person who could switch between a caring professional and a cold killer. In 2026, Paul Bernardo remains in a maximum security prison in Ontario. He has been designated a dangerous offender, meaning he will likely never be released. His repeated applications for parole have all been denied, with the board citing his continued lack of remorse. Carla Homolka was released in 2005. She changed her name and moved to Quebec, where she reportedly lives with a family of her own. The yellow house on Louth Street was demolished shortly after the trial, the ground where it stood now just an empty, grassy lot. The case of Leslie Mahaffy remains one of the most painful chapters in Canadian history, a reminder of how darkness can wear a beautiful face. The community of Burlington is quieter now, the trust that once allowed a child to sit on a porch at night replaced by a cautious, lingering watchfulness. The weight of the concrete in Ontario was meant to keep the truth from rising to the surface, a heavy silence buried in the mud. But in the vast, wooded landscapes of the Soviet Union, a different kind of monster had been hunting for over a decade. He did not use concrete or videotapes. He used the anonymity of the railway and the silence of the forest. We move now from the suburbs of Canada to the train stations of Rostov. November 21st, 1990, Rostov-on-Don. A man in a gray wool coat stood on the edge of the platform at the central railway station, his shoulders hunched against the biting Russian wind. He was carrying a worn nylon mesh bag, the kind used by many middle-aged men to hold groceries or a thermos of hot tea. To anyone passing by, he looked like a weary office worker, perhaps a bit distracted, heading home after a long shift at the local factory. He stood perfectly still, watching the trains arrive and depart with a quiet, patient intensity. A young boy named Bytom sat on a wooden bench inside the terminal, his feet swinging back and forth in the cold air. He was 11 years old and had spent the afternoon playing with friends in the city, feeling the rare thrill of independence that came with a solo trip into Rostov. He was a bright child, known in his village for his love of drawing birds and his ability to fix broken wooden toys for the younger children. He had a sister he adored and a mother who was currently at home, preparing a small celebration for his upcoming birthday. Vadim was a boy of simple, honest ambitions. He dreamed of becoming a forest ranger, spending his days in the vast green canopy of the Soviet countryside where the air was clean and the world felt ancient and solid. He carried a small notebook in his pocket, filled with sketches of the crows and sparrows he saw at the station. He was careful with his belongings, and always remembered to say thank you to the vendors who sold him sunflower seeds. His life was a collection of small, important joys that made the gray reality of the era feel warm. Isa Kostoyev sat in his cramped, dimly lit office, surrounded by stacks of manila folders that seemed to grow higher every week. He was an investigator who had been brought in from Moscow to solve a problem that the local authorities refused to admit even existed. For years, he had lived in cheap hotel rooms, away from his wife and children, consumed by the grainy photographs of victims who had vanished near the tracks. He was a man of immense patience, a person who understood that the truth was often hidden in the smallest, most repetitive details of a person's routine. Kostoyev spent his nights mapping the locations of the disappearances, looking for a pattern in the movement of the trains. He was a man who preferred the company of facts over the noise of politics. He understood that he was hunting someone who knew how to use the vastness of the Soviet Union as a shield. He felt a deep, personal responsibility for every child who did not come home, carrying their names in his mind like a heavy weight. He was the quiet, steady pulse of an investigation that many people in power wanted to see quietly disappear. The man in the gray coat lived a life of unremarkable, gray repetition that mirrored the city around him. He worked as a supply clerk, a job that required him to travel frequently to different towns along the railway lines of the Rostov region. He was a husband and a grandfather, a man who attended community meetings and was often described by his neighbors as polite but socially awkward. He had a way of blending into the background of Soviet life, a person who never stood out or caused any trouble for the local party authorities. He was a man who valued his anonymity above all else. At home, he was a provider who kept his boots polished and his workspace tidy. He spoke in a soft, dry voice and rarely showed any emotion, even when his grandchildren played loudly in the small apartment. He seemed to be a man of perfect, boring discipline. But every time he stepped onto a train platform, his internal rhythm changed. He felt a rising tide of energy that made his hands shake slightly inside the pockets of his coat, a secret pressure that only he could feel. There was a detail about the man that went unnoticed by the hundreds of people who passed him every day. His nylon bag contained a simple kitchen knife, a length of sturdy twine, and a small jar of petroleum jelly, all hidden beneath a layer of old, folded newspapers. He spoke to the people he met about the beautiful wild flowers growing in the woods just beyond the tracks, describing them with a poetic intensity that seemed slightly out of place for a casual conversation. His eyes were wide behind his thick glasses, reflecting the flickering lights of the departing trains. Vadim stood up from his bench and walked toward the platform, his notebook tucked safely away. The man smiled at him, a soft, grandfatherly expression that made the boy feel a wave of comfort in the cold evening. They began to talk about the birds in the forest, and the man mentioned a spot just a short walk away where a rare owl had been seen nesting. Vadim, eager to see the bird for his sketches, followed the man toward the dark line of the woods. They walked in silence, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the damp carpet of fallen leaves. As the last echoes of the locomotive faded into the distance, the man's posture underwent a sudden and terrifying change. He was no longer hunched or weary. He moved with a sudden predatory agility that made the boy freeze in his tracks. The man reached into his nylon bag, his face twisting into an expression of raw, hungry focus. He guided the child deeper into the darkness, where the city's noise could no longer reach them, and the trees became a wall. Days later, a group of forestry workers clearing brush along the railway line stumbled upon a patch of ground that looked unnaturally disturbed. Beneath a scattering of pine branches and old leaves, they found the remains of a young person. The scene was unlike anything the local police had ever encountered. The violence was not just brutal, it was systematic and ritualistic. There was a sense of profound desecration that suggested a killer driven by a primal hunger. It was the 43rd time such a discovery had been made in the Rostov region over 12 long years. Kostoyev launched Operation Forest Strip, a massive and unprecedented undercover mission that turned the railway system into a trap. Hundreds of police officers were dressed in civilian clothes and placed at every station and along every stretch of track where a body had been found. They were instructed to watch for anyone who seemed to be loitering or approaching children with no clear purpose. The operation was a logistical nightmare, requiring thousands of man-hours and a level of cooperation that the fractured post-revolutionary police departments found difficult to manage. The scale of the search was immense. Officers spent their nights hiding in the thick brush along the tracks, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air as they watched the shadows move. They checked the identification of thousands of men, looking for any discrepancy or any sign of a hidden life. The country was in a state of transition, and the police were working with limited resources and aging equipment. Yet, the pressure from the public and the weight of the growing body count kept the operation moving forward through the long, dark winter months of 1990. Years earlier, in 1984, a man had been detained at a train station for suspicious behavior and found with a knife in his bag. The investigators at the time were convinced they had caught their monster, but a blood test performed by a local laboratory seemed to clear him completely. His blood type did not match the biological evidence found at the crime scenes. He was released with a small fine for carrying a weapon and allowed to walk back into the shadows. It was a failure of science that would allow the killings to continue for 6 more years. Kostoyev looked back at that old file and realized that a tragic error had been made. He learned about a rare forensic anomaly where a person's blood type can differ from the type found in their other bodily fluids. This was a concept that the provincial Soviet labs were not prepared to handle at the height of the crisis. He realized that the killer had been in their hands all along, only to be let go because of a scientific misunderstanding that was as simple as it was deadly. He began to search for the man from the 1984 report. A sergeant named Igor was patrolling the Leskaz station on a cold afternoon in November. He noticed a man in a gray coat who had been standing on the platform for 3 hours without boarding a single train. The man was carrying a nylon bag and seemed to be watching a group of teenagers playing near the edge of the woods. Igor followed him at a distance, noticing how the man would occasionally stop and adjust his glasses, looking around with a furtive, nervous energy that did not match the bored expression of the other commuters waiting for their rides. When the man finally boarded a train, Igor followed him into the car and asked to see his papers. The man's hands were shaking as he handed over his identification, his fingers fumbling with the edges of his passport. His name was Andrei Chikatilo. He was a father and a grandfather, a person who had no criminal record of violence. Igor noticed a small smear of dried blood on the man's cheek, which Chikatilo claimed was from a shaving accident. Despite the lack of an immediate crime, the sergeant decided to bring him into the station for questioning. For 9 days, Chikatilo sat in an interrogation room, facing Kostoyev across a small wooden table. He was polite and cooperative, but he denied any involvement in the murders with a calm, practiced ease. He spoke about his life as a teacher and his love for his grandchildren. He seemed like a man who was incapable of the brutality found in the woods. The pressure on Kostoyev was immense. They had no physical evidence linking him to the 52 deaths, and the legal time limit for holding him without a charge was rapidly approaching its end. Kostoyev realized that a standard interrogation would never break a man like Chikatilo, who had spent a decade convincing himself of his own innocence. He needed a different approach, something that could penetrate the thick wall of denial that the suspect had built. He called in Dr. Alexander Buchanovsky, a psychiatrist who had been studying the psychological profile of the killer for years. Buchanovsky was a man of quiet, sharp intelligence, a person who understood the dark impulses and the secret shames that drive the most extreme forms of human behavior. Buchanovsky did not enter the room as an accuser or an officer of the state. He sat down and began to read aloud from a profile he had written about the killer's internal world. He described the killer's lonely childhood, his sexual frustrations, and his deep feelings of inadequacy in a society that valued strength. As the psychiatrist spoke, Chikatilo's eyes began to well with tears. He saw his own reflection in the words of the doctor, a person who was finally being understood after a lifetime of hiding in the gray background of the city. Chikatilo leaned forward over the table, his voice a dry, rasping whisper. He began to speak about the first time he had taken a life in 1978, describing the feeling of the knife and the silence of the woods. He provided the locations of graves that the police had never found, offering details that only the killer could possibly know. He spoke for hours, a flood of confessions that filled dozens of notebooks. The weight of 52 lives was finally laid bare on the table. The investigators listened in a state of stunned, horrified silence. The truth of the crimes was that Chikatilo had traveled the length of the Soviet Union, using his job as a clerk to find victims in different cities across the vast rail network. He targeted those he felt would not be missed by society, the runaways, the orphans, and the forgotten. He was a man who felt a sense of power only when he was destroying a life. The investigation revealed that the Soviet system's obsession with secrecy and its refusal to share information between districts had allowed a monster to remain invisible for over a decade. Chikatilo was a man of profound and disturbing contradictions. He was a committed communist who believed in the ideology of the state, yet he was a predator who preyed on the very citizens the state was supposed to protect. He was sexually dysfunctional, finding a twisted sense of release only through the act of murder and the desecration of the bodies. He was a person who felt deeply inadequate in his daily life, a man who sought to reclaim a sense of dominance through the most extreme and ritualistic forms of violence imaginable. The trial was a chaotic and emotional event that gripped the entire nation. Because of the intense anger of the victims' families, Chikatilo had to be kept in a large iron cage in the center of the courtroom for his own protection. He would often shout at the spectators, exposing himself and claiming that he was a mistake of nature that should never have been born. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including his own detailed confessions and the physical items found in his home. He was found guilty of 52 murders and sentenced to death. In February 1994, the sentence was carried out in a secret location within the Rostov prison. Chikatilo was led into a small, windowless room, his hands bound tightly behind his back. There was no grand speech or final act of defiance. The man who had terrorized the country for 12 years was silenced by a single shot to the back of the head. His death marked the end of an era of fear, but the scars he left on the families of the victims and the national psyche of Russia would remain for generations to come. I find it striking that even after the fall of the system that helped hide him, the tracks where he hunted remain exactly the same. As the modern railway lines continue to hum toward Rostov today, the Rostov Ripper case is still taught to every new recruit in the Russian police force as a primary lesson in failure and persistence. It is used as the foundational example of how forensic science and psychological profiling must work together to catch a phantom. Chikatilo's remains were buried in an unmarked grave, its location kept a state secret to prevent it from ever becoming a site for the disturbed. The capture of the Red Ripper was a triumph of individual persistence over a failing and secretive system. A long hunt that finally ended in the sterile light of an interrogation room. But as we move from the damp, silent forests of Russia to the sun-drenched parks of Sydney, we find that some disasters do not take 12 years to unfold. Sometimes, the most terrifying thing is not a ghost in the woods, but a man who stands up in a quiet cafe and changes the world in a single afternoon. We move now to the Strathfield Plaza. August 17, 1991. Strathfield Plaza in Sydney was humming with the steady energy of a Saturday afternoon. Roberta Armstrong sat at a small table in the Coffee Pot Cafe, her fingers tracing the rim of a porcelain cup. She was 25 years old and a student of nursing, a person whose life was dedicated to the quiet, steady work of healing others. The sunlight moved across the linoleum floors, and the air smelled of roasted beans and sugar. Roberta was known for her calm demeanor and her ability to listen without interrupting. She had spent the morning studying for her exams, the pages of her medical textbooks filled with diagrams of the human heart and the intricate pathways of the nervous system. To her, the mall was a place of transition, a brief pause where she could watch the world go by before returning to the high-stakes environment of the hospital wards, where she trained as a nurse. A few tables away sat Joyce Williams and her friend, enjoying a simple lunch after a morning of looking at winter coats. Joyce was an elderly woman who had lived in the area for decades, seeing the neighborhood change from a sleepy suburb to a bustling transport hub. She was the kind of person who always carried a small bag of hard candies to give to children she met. She enjoyed the predictable rhythms of the plaza, the way the shopkeepers knew her name and her usual order. Nearby, 15-year-old Nicole Levy was laughing at a joke made by her friend. They were at that age where the mall was a universe of its own, a place to test their independence away from the watchful eyes of their parents. Nicole was a girl with a bright future, a talented athlete who loved the feeling of the wind on her face when she was running on the track. She had her whole life mapped out in her mind, from her graduation to her first job in the city. George Mavris worked at the Plaza, a man who took pride in the cleanliness and safety of the building. He was 34 years old, a husband and a father who believed in the value of hard work and the importance of community. He was moving through the crowds with a practiced eye, nodding to the regulars, and keeping the flow of the afternoon moving smoothly. He saw the Plaza not just as a workplace, but as a living organism that needed care and attention to thrive. The atmosphere was one of total, mundane security. People were checking their watches, comparing prices on electronics, and making plans for the evening. In the basement of the Plaza, commuters were waiting for their trains, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of the departure screens. It was a Saturday like any other in the suburbs of Sydney, where the greatest concern for most people was the rising price of groceries or the outcome of a local rugby match. Among the shoppers was a man named Greg Reed. He was an ex-soldier who had seen the world and understood that peace was a fragile thing. He was at the Plaza with his young daughter, holding her hand tightly as they moved through the toy section of a department store. Greg was a man of quiet strength, someone who valued the simple safety of his family above all else. He was looking forward to a quiet dinner at home, away from the noise and the crowds of the shopping center. The Coffee Pot Cafe was the heart of this small world. It was a place where people paused to catch their breath and watch the steady stream of life. The clinking of spoons and the hiss of the espresso machine created a comforting, domestic soundtrack. No one felt like a stranger here. The shared space of the shopping center acted as a buffer against the world outside, a glass and concrete bubble where everyone was just another face in a crowd of peaceful, ordinary people. At approximately 1:45 in the afternoon, a man named Wade Frankham walked into the Coffee Pot. He was 33 years old and dressed in nondescript clothing that made him blend into the environment. He carried a large, heavy gym bag, which he placed carefully on the floor beside his chair. He ordered a black coffee and sat down, his posture rigid and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere in the middle of the room. He did not look at the menu or the other patrons. Frankham sat there for over 20 minutes, sipping his coffee in total silence. To an outside observer, he looked like a man deep in thought, or perhaps someone waiting for a friend who was running late. But there was a detail that was slightly off. He did not move his head or check his watch. He remained perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees. There was a coldness in his expression that made the waitress feel a brief moment of unease before she moved on to the next table. Suddenly, without saying a word or making a sound, Frankham reached into his gym bag. He pulled out a large knife and attacked a woman sitting at the table next to him. The movement was so fast and so unexpected that many people in the cafe thought it was a prank or a theatrical performance. There was a moment of stunned, frozen silence as the reality of the situation failed to register with the shoppers. Then, the first scream broke through the quiet hum of the afternoon. Frankham did not stop with the knife. He reached back into the bag and produced a Chinese-made SKS semi-automatic rifle. He stood up in the middle of the cafe and began to fire indiscriminately. The sound of the gunshots was deafening in the enclosed space, echoing off the tile walls and the glass storefronts. People began to dive under tables and scramble for the exits, their movements frantic and chaotic. The peaceful bubble of the Strathfield Plaza had been violently punctured. The investigation would later reconstruct the movements of the gunman with terrifying precision. After the initial shots in the cafe, Frankum moved out into the main mall area. He walked with a steady, purposeful gait, as if he were following a pre-planned route. He fired at anyone he saw, targeting shoppers who were trapped in the narrow hallways of the plaza. The security cameras captured his image, a man who looked completely calm while he systematically destroyed the lives of strangers. Police officers from the local station arrived within minutes, but the layout of the plaza made it difficult for them to locate the shooter. The sound of the shots was bouncing off the hard surfaces, making it seem like the gunfire was coming from multiple directions at once. The emergency dispatchers were overwhelmed with calls from people hiding in dressing rooms and storage closets, their voices whispering in the dark as they described the carnage they could hear just outside the doors. The tactical response team began to move through the building, clearing shops one by one. They found scenes of absolute devastation. People had been shot while they were looking at books or waiting for their children. The investigators noticed that Frankum had not targeted any specific person or group. He was simply firing at the nearest human shape. It was a rampage that lacked any apparent logic or motive, which made the unfolding disaster feel even more unpredictable and terrifying. Witnesses described how Frankum would occasionally pause to reload his weapon, his hands moving with a mechanical efficiency. He did not shout or make demands. He was a silent predator in a suburban landscape. The mall's fire alarm had been triggered by the smoke from the gunfire, and the flashing lights and wailing sirens added to the confusion. People were running in every direction, some toward the exits and others deeper into the building, trapped by their own panic. The shooter eventually made his way toward the roof of the plaza, taking the stairs near the cinema complex. He was moving toward a higher vantage point, perhaps looking for a place to make a final stand. The police were closing in, their movements coordinated through radio headsets. They could see the shadow of the gunman on the upper levels, but they were careful not to rush him, fearing that he would fire down into the crowded streets below if he felt cornered. Amidst the terror, there were moments of extraordinary courage. Greg Reed, the ex-soldier, had managed to push his daughter into a safe corner of a shop when the shooting began. Instead of running for the exit, he stayed behind to help others. He used a heavy wooden chair to shield a group of elderly shoppers, standing between them and the path of the gunman. He provided critical information to the arriving police, describing the type of weapon Frankum was using and his direction. Another hero was a man named George Mavris, the plaza employee who had been working nearby. He used his keys to open emergency exits and guided hundreds of people to safety through the back service corridors. He stayed at his post until the very last person had passed through the doors, even as the sound of the rifle grew closer. These individuals acted with a selfless clarity that stood in direct contrast to the senseless, cold violence of the man who had arrived with the gym bag. I observed that the most haunting detail of the aftermath was not the broken glass or the bullet holes, but the abandoned personal items left behind in the panic. There was a single, child-sized sneaker sitting in the middle of a hallway, and a half-finished cup of coffee on a table with a spoon still resting on the saucer. These small objects were the final marks of a normal afternoon that had been suddenly and irrevocably abandoned. They represented the lives that had been interrupted. Frankum reached the top floor of the parking garage, looking out over the suburbs of Sydney. He was surrounded by police snipers, who had taken positions on the neighboring rooftops. The sirens of dozens of ambulances filled the air. Frankum stood at the edge of the building, his rifle still in his hand. He looked down at the chaos he had created, his expression as blank as it had been in the cafe. As the police began their final approach, he turned the weapon on himself. The final shot rang out at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon. With the death of the gunman, the active threat was over, but the disaster was far from finished. The medical teams moved into the plaza, triaging the wounded and confirming the deaths of 7 people. The shopping center was turned into a forensic laboratory, the bright lights illuminating a scene that would stay with the first responders for the rest of their lives. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. In the days following the massacre, investigators searched Wade Frankum's apartment in the suburb of Knychała. They found a small, sparsely furnished room that reflected his social isolation. He had no close friends and rarely spoke to his neighbors. He was a man who lived entirely within his own mind, a taxi driver who navigated the city every day but never truly connected with the people he served. There was no suicide note and no manifesto explaining his actions to the world. They did find a collection of violent literature and magazines that focused on survivalism and weapons. Frankum had spent his free time obsessing over these materials, building a fantasy world where he was a powerful figure rather than a lonely driver. He had legally purchased his firearms, taking advantage of the relatively loose gun laws that existed in Australia at the time. His descent into violence was a slow process of radicalization that occurred in the total silence of his home. Frankum was described by forensic psychiatrists as a man with deep-seated feelings of inadequacy and a profound sense of social failure. He felt invisible to the world, and the massacre was his way of forcing the world to finally see him. He did not have a history of mental illness that had been officially recorded, which made his sudden break into mass murder even more difficult for society to understand. He was a person who had slipped through every social net until he finally exploded. The Strathfield massacre became a primary catalyst for the complete overhaul of Australian gun laws in 1996. Walking through the quiet, glass-walled hallways of the plaza now remains a busy shopping hub, but a small, quiet memorial stands near the entrance of the coffee pot. It lists the names of the 7 people who lost their lives that afternoon. The event is remembered as the moment the country realized that the safety of the suburbs was an illusion that required constant, vigilant protection. The families of the victims still meet every year to light candles and share stories of the people they lost. Roberta, Joyce, Nicole, and the others are remembered not for how they died, but for the lives they lived before the gym bag was opened. The plaza has been renovated many times, but for those who were there, the echoes of the sirens never truly fade. The story of Strathfield is a story of how a single Saturday can become a permanent part of the grief of an entire nation. The silence in the mall was eventually replaced by the sound of reconstruction and new shoppers, a slow healing of the physical space. But in the rural landscape of Heilongjiang, China, a different kind of silence was being prepared. It was not a sudden explosion in a crowded mall, but a calculated, list-based revenge that moved through the dark of winter. We move now from the suburbs of Sydney to the cold, flickering light of a kerosene lamp in a northern village. January 19th, 1990. The temperature in the remote village of Heilongjiang had dropped to 40 degrees below zero. The air was so cold it felt like inhaled glass. A man named Guan Yazhou sat in his small hut, watching the yellow flame of a kerosene lamp flicker against the frosted window. He was 45 years old, with a weathered face and hands that had spent decades pulling life from the frozen earth of northern China. He sat perfectly still, his breath forming a faint mist in the unheated room, listening to the wind howl against the timber walls of his home. Li Wei lived 3 doors down from the silence of the hut belonging to Guan. He was a village elder who took great pride in his small plot of land and his 2 young grandsons. Li Wei was the kind of man who woke up before the sun to check the irrigation lines, his breath forming thick clouds in the pre-dawn dark. He always shared his tobacco with the younger workers, offering a steady hand and a story to those struggling with the heavy labor of the harvest. He felt a deep sense of belonging to this earth, believing that if he cared for the soil would care for his family in return. Li Wei's daughter, Mei Ling, was busy preparing for the Lunar New Year celebrations that were only weeks away. She was 24, with a quick smile and a habit of singing traditional folk songs while she mended her father's heavy winter coats. She dreamed of saving enough money to buy a high-quality sewing machine so she could make clothes for everyone in the village. Her life was filled with the small, necessary chores of rural survival, but she felt a deep sense of peace. She loved the way the village felt safe and predictable, a place where every door was left unlocked and every face was familiar. The two grandsons, Little Bao and June, spent their afternoons playing in the high snowdrifts near the communal well. They were 7 and 5 years old, full of an energy that seemed to defy the freezing temperatures. They would build miniature fortresses out of ice blocks, pretending they were the guardians of the Great Wall. Their laughter was a constant soundtrack to the village afternoon, a sound that reminded the older residents of why they worked so hard. They were the future of the village, the ones who would eventually take over the plows and the seeds when their grandfather was too old to walk the fields. The village head, a man named Zhang, was the person responsible for the distribution of the local land. He was an authoritative figure who walked with a heavy cane and spoke with a voice that brooked no argument. Zhang was a man who understood the complicated bureaucracy of the provincial government and knew how to navigate the shifting politics of the era. He was often seen in the village office, surrounded by stacks of paper and heavy ledgers. He believed that his primary duty was to maintain order and ensure that the village met its production quotas, even if it meant making difficult decisions about who got the best soil. Life in Heilongjiang followed the rhythm of the seasons with a mechanical precision. In the winter, the village became a quiet, white world where the main activity was survival. People spent their days chopping wood, tending to the coal stoves, and making sure the livestock stayed warm. The evenings were spent indoors, sharing simple meals of cabbage and salted pork. It was a life of extreme hardship, but there was a quiet dignity in the way the neighbors supported one another. They were a community bound by the shared struggle against the climate and the land, a bond that felt as old as the mountains themselves. There was a subtle tension in the village regarding the recent land reforms. Some families felt that the best plots were being given to those with connections to the local office, while others were left with rocky, infertile soil. Li Wei often heard the whispers at the market, the quiet complaints about unfairness and the lack of transparency in Zhang's decisions. But most people, including Li Wei, chose to stay quiet. They believed that complaining would only bring trouble and that it was better to be content with what they had. They valued the stability of the community over the uncertainty of a legal challenge. Guan Yazhou was one of the men who felt the weight of this tension more than most. He had once owned a fertile strip of land near the river, but it had been reassigned to a relative of a local official 2 years earlier. He was left with a patch of earth that was difficult to drain and even harder to plow. Guan had tried to speak with Zhang many times, bringing his old deeds and maps to the village office, but he was always turned away. He was told that the decisions were final and that he should be grateful for whatever land the state allowed him to work. He never shouted. He just listened. Guan began to withdraw from the social life of the village. He stopped attending the communal meals and rarely spoke to the other men at the well. He spent his days working his poor land with a grim, silent determination. When the sun went down, he would return to his hut and close the heavy door, shutting out the world. His neighbors noticed that his light stayed on long into the night, casting a lonely yellow glow onto the snow. They assumed he was simply a bitter man who had lost his spirit, a person who had been broken by the unfairness of the system and had chosen to live in his own shadow. Mailing was the only one who noticed that Guan's behavior had shifted from bitterness to something more focused. She saw him sitting on his porch in the late afternoon, sharpening a long, heavy kitchen knife against a whetstone. The sound of the metal scraping against the stone was rhythmic and hypnotic. Guan didn't look up when she passed by. His eyes were fixed on the blade with an intensity that made her quicken her pace. He seemed to be preparing for something, his movements slow and deliberate, like a hunter getting ready for a long winter trek. She mentioned it to her father, but he told her not to worry. A few days later, Mailing saw Guan moving several heavy wooden crates into his hut. They were marked with the symbols of the local mining company, the kind used to transport industrial blasting caps and dynamite. She thought it was strange, as Guan had no reason to be doing any blasting on his rocky plot during the dead of winter. She watched from her window as he carried the crates with a surprising strength for a man of his age. He moved with a sense of purpose that he hadn't shown in years. He was no longer the defeated man who stared at the ground. He was a man who moved with a cold, quiet energy. The night of January 19th began like any other winter evening. The village was tucked away under a blanket of snow, and the moon was a silver sliver in the black sky. Li Wei had just finished reading a story to his grandsons, and the house was settling into the quiet of sleep. The only sound was the occasional pop of the coal in the stove. Then a sharp metallic crack echoed through the village, followed by a second and a third. It sounded like the ice on the river was breaking, but the rhythm was too fast and too regular. It was the sound of a rifle being fired in the cold night air. Mailing ran to the window and saw a dark figure moving toward the village office. The building was already beginning to glow with an orange light as flames licked at the wooden window frames. The figure was Guan Yazhou. He was carrying a long-range hunting rifle and a heavy canvas bag slung over his shoulder. He moved with a terrifying, mechanical efficiency, his silhouette sharp against the fire. He didn't look like he was in a hurry. He walked toward the house of the land official, his boots crunching loudly on the frozen ground. He looked like a man who was simply going about his daily chores. The first explosion happened at the village office. It was not a large blast, but it was enough to blow out the windows and send a shower of sparks into the night. The records of the land deeds, the books that held the history of every family's struggles and successes, were being consumed by the fire. Guan stood in the middle of the road, watching the building burn for a moment before he turned toward the residential huts. He pulled a list from his pocket, checking it by the light of the fire. Then, he moved toward the first name on the paper, his rifle held at the ready against his shoulder. Li Wei rushed outside, his coat half-buttoned, thinking that a stove had exploded. He saw Guan standing near the communal well, reloading his rifle with a practiced hand. Li Wei called out to him, asking what was happening and if he needed help. Guan did not answer. He simply raised the rifle and fired. The bullet struck the wooden post beside Li Wei's head, sending a spray of splinters into the air. Li Wei dived into the snow, his heart hammering against his ribs. He realized then that the man he had known for 20 years was gone. In his place was a predator who was hunting his own neighbors. The village was suddenly filled with the sounds of chaos. People were screaming, doors were being kicked in, and the smell of gunpowder mixed with the freezing air. Guan moved from house to house with a chilling sense of selection. He did not fire at everyone he saw. He targeted the people on his list, the officials, the committee members, and their families. He used his handmade explosives to blow open the heavy doors of those who tried to hide. He was systematic, moving through the village like a ghost that was settling a long overdue debt. He was a man who had decided that the only way to find justice was to burn the village down. The local police force consisted of only 4 men, and they were stationed in a town 10 miles away. When the first reports of the fire reached them, They struggled to start their aging patrol vehicle in the extreme cold. By the time they reached the outskirts of Heilongjiang, the massacre had been underway for over 2 hours. They were met with a scene of absolute devastation. The central office was a smoldering ruin, and bodies were scattered in the snow like discarded dolls. The officers were terrified. They had never faced anything like this, and they had no idea where the shooter was hiding in the darkened huts. The investigation would later show that the police were nearly paralyzed by the conditions. Their flashlights were failing in the 40 below temperatures, and their radios were filled with static. They moved in a tight group, their weapons drawn, peering into every shadow. They found survivors who were catatonic with fear, huddled in corners and refusing to speak. The officers realized that Guan had the advantage of knowing every shortcut and hiding place in the village. He was not just a shooter. He was a man who had integrated himself into the very geography of the place he was now destroying. He was a shadow among shadows. They found the body of Zhang, the village head, near the remains of the office. He had been shot at close range while he was trying to save the ledgers. The killer had then used a small explosive to destroy the safe where the most important land documents were kept. It was a clear sign that Guan's primary target was the system of ownership itself. He wanted to erase the records that had defined his failure. He was not just killing people, he was killing the bureaucracy that had ignored him. He was a man who believed that if he could destroy the paper, he could reclaim the dignity that had been taken from him. The search continued through the night. The police found the house of Li Wei, where the front door had been blown off its hinges. Inside, they found Mei Ling and the 2 grandsons hiding in the cellar, shivering with cold and terror. Li Wei was still outside, lost in the woods, where he had fled after the first shot. The officers could hear the occasional crack of a rifle in the distance, but the sound was muffled by the wind and the falling snow. It was impossible to tell where the next attack would come from. The village had become a trap, a maze of red snow and black smoke where a neighbor was the ultimate enemy. The forensic reconstruction of the night would reveal that Guan had killed 27 people. He had used exactly 34 rounds of ammunition and 6 handmade explosives. Every shot was a calculated move. He had spent months planning the sequence of the attacks, ensuring that he could move from one target to the next without being cornered. He was a man who had applied a military-grade discipline to a personal grievance. The investigators were stunned by the level of organization. This was not a crime of passion, but a crime of absolute, cold logic. He had turned his hut into a command center for a private war. One of the surviving neighbors, an elderly woman named Mrs. Gao, later told the police that she had seen Guan during the height of the violence. She said he looked remarkably calm, almost peaceful. He had stopped at the communal well to take a drink of water, his rifle resting casually against the stone. He had looked at her and nodded, as if they were just passing each other on a normal Tuesday afternoon. He didn't seem angry or frantic. He looked like a man who had finally finished a very difficult piece of work and was simply waiting for the sun to rise so he could see the results. The police eventually found a way to track Guan by following the scent of the explosives. He had left a trail of acrid smoke that hung in the frozen air despite the wind. They followed the path toward the frozen river that marked the edge of the village territory. They saw his silhouette against the gray light of the early morning. He was standing on the ice, looking back toward the burning village. He was out of ammunition, and his heavy canvas bag was empty. He looked smaller than he had in the firelight, just a lone man standing in the vast, empty landscape of the northern winter. The police closed in from 3 sides, their boots sliding on the slick ice. They called out to him to surrender, their voices thin and high in the freezing air. Guan did not move. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the list of names. He looked at it for a long time, then folded it carefully and tucked it back into his coat. He did not look at the officers. He looked at the horizon where the sun was just beginning to break through the clouds. He had achieved his goal. The names on the list were gone, and the records that had tied him to a life of failure were ashes in the wind. I noticed that on the back of the list, Guan had written the words for justice and fairness over and over until the ink bled through the paper and stained his fingers. He didn't see himself as a murderer. In his fractured mind, he was a judge who was settling a debt that the law refused to acknowledge. He felt that his land had been stolen by corrupt officials, and since there was no court to hear his case, he had turned the village into his own private courtroom where he held the only vote. He believed that blood was the only thing that could wash away the stain of his humiliation. The final confrontation was brief. As the police reached within 20 yards of him, Guan pulled a final stick of dynamite from a hidden pocket in his sleeve. He struck a match with a steady hand, the flame a tiny spark of yellow in the gray dawn. He did not run toward the officers, and he did not try to throw the explosive. He simply held it to his chest and waited. The explosion was muffled by the thick ice of the river, a dull thud that sent a cloud of white mist into the air. When the smoke cleared, Guan Yazhou was gone, along with the list that had dictated the fate of the village. The aftermath of the Guan Yazhou spree was a long, silent period of mourning for Heilongjiang. The village was shattered, not just by the loss of 27 lives, but by the realization of how much hate had been hiding in their midst. The government quickly moved in to rebuild the village office and replace the records, but the trust that had held the community together could not be repaired. Li Wei and Mei Ling eventually left the village, unable to live in a place where every corner was a reminder of the night of the list. They moved to a city far to the south, looking for a place where the winter was not so heavy. The true motive for the massacre was land corruption. Investigations revealed that Zhang and the local committee had indeed been reassigning plots to their relatives in exchange for favors and money. Guan had been a victim of a systemic theft that was occurring all across the province. His complaints had been ignored because the people he was complaining to were the ones who were profiting from the scheme. The massacre was an explosive manifestation of a social tension that had been building for decades. Guan was a man who felt that the only way to be heard in a silent system was to make a noise that no one could ignore. Guan Yazhou was a veteran of the People's Liberation Army, having served in an engineering unit during the late 1970s. This was where he had learned the skills required to handle explosives and plan a tactical operation. His military service had taught him how to stay calm under pressure and how to focus on a target with a singular, deadly intent. This background made him a far more dangerous predator than a typical disgruntled citizen. He was a trained soldier who had turned his skills against his own people, applying the logic of a battlefield to the streets of his home. Forensic psychologists who studied the case through the 99 files noted that Guan exhibited signs of a deep-seated personality disorder exacerbated by chronic stress and social isolation. He was a man who could not reconcile his high expectations for himself with the reality of his poverty. He viewed every setback as a personal insult, and every official as a mortal enemy. He was a man who lived in a state of constant, quiet rage. A pressure cooker that finally exploded when he realized that his life would never change through legal means. He was a man who chose a horrific final act of control over a lifetime of perceived powerlessness. In the silent, frost-covered archives of the present day, the declassified documents from the Heilongjiang Provincial Archives have shed new light on the events of 1990. The documents confirm that the local government tried to cover up the scale of the massacre for years to prevent social unrest. The true number of victims was only revealed after a thorough audit of the regional census records in 2024. The case is now used in Chinese police academies as a primary example of revenge against society crimes, focusing on the importance of local grievance management to prevent individuals from reaching the point of no return. The village of Heilongjiang is mostly a ghost town today. As the older generation passed away, the younger people moved to the industrial centers of the south, leaving the brick huts to crumble under the weight of the snow. The river where Guan Yazhou ended his life is still there, but it is now marked by a small, unmarked concrete pylon. The older residents who remain do not speak his name, but they still keep their kerosene lamps burning late into the night. They are still looking for the shadows in the snow, the ghosts of a list that was written 36 years ago. The frozen fields of northern China held the memory of a list and a fire, a private war that ended in a muffled thud on the ice. But as we move from the cold of Heilongjiang to the stagnant, humid heat of the Brazilian scrubland, we find a different kind of darkness. It was not a list of names or a grievance over land, but a hunger that came from the spirit. It was a ritual that required the lives of the innocent to feed a delusion that Guan Yazhou could never have imagined. We move now from the rifle to the handmade cross of Aracaju. January 14th, 1991, Aracaju, Brazil. Lucas stood at the edge of a dusty road, shielding his eyes from the white glare of the afternoon sun. He was 12 years old, with skin the color of polished mahogany and a frame that was lean and strong from years of physical work. The air was heavy and still, smelling of dry grass and the distant salt of the Atlantic Ocean. He held a rusted iron rod in his hand, using it to poke through a pile of debris near a construction site. Lucas lived in a small house in one of the neighborhoods that sprawled across the northern edge of the city. His home was built from scavenged bricks and corrugated metal, but inside, his mother kept everything spotless. He was the eldest of 4 children, a boy who had stepped into the role of a provider before he had even reached puberty. He took this responsibility with a quiet, somber pride that made him look older than his years. Every morning, Lucas would wake up before the heat became unbearable. He would drink a cup of strong, sweet coffee and then grab a heavy burlap sack from the corner of the room. His mission was simple but essential. Find enough scrap metal, aluminum cans, or discarded copper wire to trade for a few handfuls of beans and rice. He knew every alleyway and every vacant lot in the district, his eyes always scanning the ground for the glint of something valuable. His mother, María, worked as a laundress for the wealthier families in the center of the city. She would leave before dawn, returning late in the evening with her hands raw and white from the soap. Lucas would always be there to meet her, helping her carry the heavy baskets of wet clothes. They had a silent agreement that education was the way out of the favela, and Lucas worked hard so that his younger sister, Elena, could afford the books she needed for school. Elena was a bright girl who loved to draw. She would sit on the dirt floor of their house, using pieces of charcoal to sketch birds and flowers on any scrap of paper Lucas managed to find. Lucas would watch her, feeling a deep sense of purpose. He promised her that one day he would find enough copper to buy her a real set of colored pencils. It was a small goal, but to Lucas, it represented everything he wanted for his family. He was a boy who measured success in the weight of his burlap sack. The neighborhood was a place of high walls and low expectations. People moved through the streets with a weary, practiced caution. There were stories of boys who went to the city and never came back. But Lucas felt safe because he knew the rhythms of the streets. He was a familiar face, a hard worker who never caused trouble. He believed that as long as he stayed focused on his task and returned home before the shadows grew too long, the city would allow him to exist in peace. Lucas had a favorite spot near the industrial outskirts, where the brush grew thick and the old factories dumped their waste. It was a lonely place, away from the noise of the traffic, where the silence was only broken by the buzzing of flies and the rustle of the wind in the scrubland. He had found his best haul of copper there a month ago, and he returned to it often, hoping for another stroke of luck. He viewed the desolate landscape not as a place of danger, but as a field of potential. On the afternoon of January 14th, Lucas was working near a stand of gnarled trees. He was focused on a pile of discarded industrial cables, his fingers working to strip the plastic coating away. He did not notice the man standing at the edge of the clearing. The man was dressed in clean, sturdy work clothes, looking like a laborer from one of the nearby warehouses. He was a middle-aged man with a friendly, unassuming face that did not seem to belong in such a desolate place. The man, who introduced himself as Edmilson, called out to Lucas in a soft, melodic voice. He told the boy that he worked for a construction company nearby and that they had a large pile of scrap metal that needed to be cleared. He said he was looking for a strong, reliable boy to help him move the heavy pieces, and he promised to pay in cash. Lucas looked at the man's hands, which were calloused and stained with grease. He looked like the kind of man Lucas's father had been. Lucas felt a surge of excitement. The offer was more than he could make in a week of scavenging. He thought about the colored pencils for Elena and the extra rice for his mother. He agreed to help, picking up his sack and following Edmilson deeper into the thick brush. The man talked about his own children, telling stories of a small farm in the countryside where the mangoes were as big as a man's head. His voice was a steady, comforting hum that masked the sound of their footsteps on the dry leaves. They walked for nearly 20 minutes, moving away from the visible landmarks of the factories. The brush grew taller, closing in around them like a green wall. Lucas began to feel a slight prickle of unease. He asked how much further the construction site was, noticing that the ground was becoming soft and uneven. Edmilson pointed toward a small clearing ahead where a handmade wooden cross sat atop a small mound of earth. He said they were almost there, and his voice dropped to a whisper. María returned home that evening to a house that was unnaturally quiet. The coffee pot was cold, and Elena was sitting on the porch, staring at the road. Lucas had never been late. She waited for an hour, then 2, her anxiety rising with every passing minute. She went to the neighbors, asking if they had seen her son, but no one had seen him since the early afternoon. The neighborhood, usually so full of life, felt suddenly cold and indifferent to her panic. By the next morning, the police station in Aracaju was filled with the sounds of Maria's grief, but the officers were dismissive. They told her that 12-year-old boys in the favelas often ran away to the bigger cities like Sao Paulo or Rio de Janeiro. They suggested he had joined a gang or simply decided to start a new life. They refused to open a file, telling María to come back in a week if he hadn't returned. They did not see a missing child. They saw a statistic. María did not give up. She organized a group of mothers from the neighborhood, and they began their own search. They walked the streets, showing a photo of Lucas to the vendors and the truck drivers. They went to the scrap yards and the construction sites, but no one remembered seeing the boy with the burlap sack. It was as if he had simply dissolved into the heat of the afternoon. María felt a heavy, hollow ache in her chest, a mother's intuition that her son was no longer in the city. A week later, another boy went missing. His name was Paulo, a 10-year-old who also collected scrap metal to support his mother. The pattern began to emerge. Over the next 3 months, 5 boys vanished from the same district. The neighborhood was paralyzed by fear. Parents began to lock their children inside, and the streets were abandoned long before sunset. The rumors of a monster in the brush began to grow, fueled by the silence of the police and the growing number of empty chairs at dinner tables. The investigation finally began in earnest when a group of hunters found a small, disturbing site in the scrubland near the industrial zone. They found a series of shallow graves, each marked by a crude, handmade wooden cross. The earth was freshly turned, and the air carried a heavy, sweet scent that did not belong in the dry woods. I noticed that the crosses were all the same size, tied together with bits of industrial twine, a detail that suggested a terrifying level of ritual and planning. The police arrived and began the grim task of excavation. They found the remains of Lucas, identified by the small, rusted iron rod that was still clutched in his hand. He had not been robbed. His burlap sack, filled with the copper he had worked so hard to collect, was buried right beside him. The scene was one of profound, silent horror. The investigators realized they were not looking for a gang or a kidnapper. They were looking for a predator who found a dark, spiritual meaning in the act of murder. The break in the case came from a witness who had seen a man talking to Paulo on the day he disappeared. The description was of a nondescript laborer named Edmilson da Silva Filho. He was a man who worked as a general handyman in the district, known for his quiet demeanor and his willingness to take on any job. He was a man who lived alone in a small shack near the edge of the woods, a person who had spent his entire life in the shadows of the city. When the police raided Edmilson's shack, they found a scene that would haunt the city for decades. The walls were covered in handwritten prayers and religious symbols, many of them distorted and strange. They found a collection of children's items, a single sneaker, a school notebook, and a set of charcoal drawings that had belonged to Lucas. They also found a large supply of industrial twine and a pile of wooden stakes. Edmilson sat in the center of the room, his expression one of perfect, terrifying calm. During the interrogation, Edmilson did not deny his actions. He spoke in a soft, melodic voice about the voices that guided him. He claimed that he was a messenger for a higher power that required the lives of the innocent to maintain the balance of the world. He believed that by killing the boys and burying them with their possessions, he was sending them to a better place while gaining their strength for himself. He described the murders with a clinical precision, showing no remorse and no empathy. He told the detectives how he would watch the boys for days, learning their routines and their vulnerabilities. He chose the hardest workers, the ones who were most dedicated to their families, because he believed their spirits were the purest. He used their own dreams against them, promising them the means to help their mothers and sisters. He viewed himself not as a killer, but as a harvester of souls. He was a man who had replaced his own humanity with a complex, violent delusion. The climax of the case was the discovery of the ritual sites deeper in the brush. Edmilson led the police to several more locations where he had performed ceremonies over the bodies. He had consumed parts of his victims, believing it was the only way to truly absorb their essence. The level of depravity was beyond anything the Brazilian forensic teams had ever seen. The Cannibal of Aracaju became a name that brought a chill to the heart of every parent in the country, a symbol of the ultimate betrayal of trust. The legal outcome was swift. Edmilson was found guilty of multiple counts of murder and cannibalism. Because Brazil does not have the death penalty, he was sentenced to the maximum term of 30 years in a psychiatric prison. The trial was a national scandal, exposing the deep social inequalities that allowed the disappearances of poor children to go unnoticed for so long. The families of the victims, led by María, fought for years to improve the way the police handled missing persons cases in the favelas. Edmilson da Silva was a man who had lived his entire life in a state of growing isolation and mental decay. He was a highly organized predator who used his knowledge of the local culture and religious traditions to mask his crimes. His profile showed a man with severe schizophrenia and a narcissistic God complex. He was able to blend in as a harmless worker because he understood how to mimic the social cues of the community, a trait that made him far more dangerous than an obvious monster. Where the scrubland has long since been cleared for new homes, the case of Edmilson da Silva remains a primary study for Brazilian criminologists focusing on ritualistic violence and serial murder. He died in prison several years ago, but his legacy continues to influence the way the state monitors high-risk psychiatric offenders. The district where the murders occurred has changed. The brush has been cleared for new housing developments, but the older residents still avoid the areas where the crosses were found. They remember the year when the earth in the scrubland became a place of secrets. María and Elena eventually left Aracaju, moving to a small town in the interior. Elena became a teacher, and she still keeps the charcoal sketches she made as a child. She never got the colored pencils from Lucas, but she carries his memory in the way she protects her own students. The house they left behind is gone, but the story of the boy with the burlap sack is still told in the favelas, a warning to the children who look for copper in the long shadows of the afternoon. The ritual in the Brazilian brush was a feverish, internal nightmare that required the blood of the innocent to sustain itself. But as we move from the stagnant heat of Aracaju to the coal-dusted streets of Bytom, Poland, we find a different kind of obsession. It was not driven by voices or spirits, but by a cold, intellectual admiration for another killer. It was the story of a man who went to a trial to learn how to be a better monster. We move now from the cross to the courtroom notebook. March 26, 1990. The walls of the prison in Krakow felt unusually cold, the dampness of the ancient stones seeping through the heavy layers of winter clothes worn by the guards. Joachim Knychała stood in the center of a small, windowless room, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back. He was 37 years old, a man of average build with a face that looked like it belonged to a tired accountant or a quiet, unassuming librarian. He did not ask for mercy, and he did not offer a final prayer to the silent witnesses. He simply stared at the gray floor, waiting for the final act of a life that had been defined by a dark, borrowed obsession. Years earlier, in the late 1970s, Joachim lived in the industrial heart of Silesia. Bytom was a city built on coal and steel, where the sky was often a heavy metallic gray that never seemed to clear, even in the height of summer. He worked at the local mine, his face covered in a thick, gritty layer of soot for 8 hours a day. To his neighbors, he was a steady provider, a man who loved his wife and took his children to the park on Sundays. He was a pillar of the community, a worker who understood the value of silence and the necessity of hard work. He had a gentle way of speaking to his elderly neighbors, often helping them carry their groceries up the steep, narrow stairs of their apartment buildings. One of his victims was a young woman named Helena. She was 21 years old and worked as a clerk in a local government office near the center of the city. Helena was known for her bright yellow scarf and her habit of feeding the stray cats near the train station every morning before her shift began. She was a woman of simple dreams, saving her meager earnings to buy a new coat for the winter and hoping to one day travel to the mountains in the south. She felt safe in Bytom, a city where everyone knew everyone, and the rhythmic sound of the mining machinery was a constant, comforting heartbeat. She walked home every night without a second thought, enjoying the crisp evening air and the predictable sights of her neighborhood. In 1975, a massive trial took place in the region that captured the attention of the entire country. Zdzisław Marchwicki, the most notorious serial killer in Polish history, was being sentenced for a decade of horrific crimes. Joachim Knychała did not watch the news from home like the rest of the city. He went to the courtroom every single day, sitting in the back row with a small, leather-bound notebook tucked into his jacket. He watched how the prosecutor presented the evidence, and he listened to every mistake that Marchwicki had made during his long reign of terror. He was not there for justice. He was there for an education in the art of the hunt, his pen moving quickly over the paper to capture every detail of the investigation. I noticed that while the rest of the audience gasped at the gruesome photos of the crime scenes, Joachim leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the grain of the black and white images. He was not looking at the victims. He was looking at the shadows in the corners of the frames, trying to identify where the light failed and where the police had found the clues. He was a student of murder, preparing himself to surpass the man who was about to be executed. He viewed Marchwicki not as a monster, but as a flawed predecessor whose only real crime was being caught by a system he should have outsmarted. He wanted to be the one who would never be caught. Soon after the trial ended, the attacks began to haunt the industrial suburbs of Bytom and Pechory-Shlonsky. Women were being ambushed in dark hallways, in the narrow stairwells of apartment blocks, and near the rusted iron gates of the coal mines. The attacker was fast, silent, and incredibly brutal, using a heavy blunt object to strike with a precision that left no room for escape or a cry for help. The police were baffled and embarrassed by the sudden surge in violence. They had just celebrated the capture of the first vampire, and now a second one was haunting the very same streets. It felt as if the spirit of Marchwicki had jumped from one man to another in the darkness of the city. The investigation was led by a captain who had spent his career chasing petty thieves and public drunks. He was not prepared for a predator who moved with the discipline of a soldier and the invisibility of a ghost. The police conducted massive sweeps of the mining dormitories, checking the alibis of thousands of workers who looked exactly like the man they were searching for. They looked for blood-stained clothes and hidden weapons in the metal lockers, but they found nothing. Joachim continued to go to work every day, his productivity in the mine never wavering. He was a shadow in a city made of red brick and thick coal dust, a man who blended perfectly into the gray background of the industrial landscape. Joachim was careful to vary his timing and his locations to keep the police guessing. He never struck in the same neighborhood twice in a row, often traveling miles on foot through the industrial landscape to find a new hunting ground. He learned to use the scheduled blackouts and the steam from the factory pipes to mask his movements through the alleyways and between the rows of tenement houses. He would often return home to his wife, María, and tell her about the latest rumors he heard at the mine about the murders. He would sit at the dinner table, eating soup and discussing the vampire as if he were a distant, terrifying legend. He enjoyed the secret power of knowing what the rest of the city only feared. María began to notice small, strange things about her husband that she could not explain to herself. He would often go for long walks in the middle of the night, claiming he could not sleep because of the vibration of the machinery deep underground. She found a pair of his work boots in the hallway, the soles covered in a dark, sticky substance that did not look like coal dust or motor oil. When she asked him about it, his expression changed in a way that made her blood run cold. For a brief second, the kind father vanished, replaced by a man with eyes as cold as the Siberian winter. He told her never to touch his boots again, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rasp. The suspicion in the household began to grow like a slow-moving poison in the air between them. María eventually found a collection of newspaper clippings about the murders hidden under the loose floorboards in their bedroom. They were not just reports. They were meticulously annotated with dates, times, and weather conditions. She saw her husband's handwriting in the margins, noting the presence of witnesses and the response time of the local police. She realized then that Joachim was not just interested in the news as a concerned citizen. He was documenting his own dark progress through the city. She lived in a state of silent, paralyzed terror for her children, afraid to speak and afraid to stay in the house. The end of his reign came during a botched attack in the middle of a warm summer night in 1982. Joachim had targeted a woman near a local park, but he had underestimated her will to survive. She fought back with a ferocity he had not expected, screaming for help and clawing at his face until she drew blood. A group of miners coming off their shift heard the commotion and ran toward the shadows with their heavy flashlights. Joachim was forced to flee into the woods, leaving behind a distinctive tool he had taken from the mine. The police at last had a piece of physical evidence that could not be explained away by a ghost or a legend. The tool found at the scene was a specialized wrench used only in the deepest levels of the Dimitro mine. It was a heavy, blackened piece of iron with a unique serial number etched into the handle. The detective spent 3 days going through the equipment logs, matching the number to a specific set of tools issued to the night shift. When they finally found the name associated with the wrench, the room went silent. It was Joachim Knychała, a man who had never been in trouble and who was considered one of the most reliable workers on the floor. The investigators realized they were not looking for a drifter, but for one of their own people, a man who knew the city better than they did. When the police at last arrived at the house on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, they did not find a man preparing to run. Joachim was sitting on his porch in the sunlight, watching his children play in the yard with a small wooden truck he had made for them from scraps of timber. He greeted the officers with a slow, deliberate nod, as if he had been expecting them for a very long time. He did not ask what they wanted or why they were there in such numbers. He simply stood up, dusted off his trousers, and walked toward the patrol car with a calm, steady gait that was more unsettling than a struggle. His wife watched from the doorway, her hands shaking as she held the curtain. The arrest was conducted in total silence, a sharp contrast to the violence that had defined the last few years in Bytom. There were no sirens and no shouting, just the sound of car doors closing and the crunch of gravel under tires. Joachim sat in the back of the car, his face devoid of any emotion, looking out the window at the familiar streets of his neighborhood. He did not look back at his house or his family as the car pulled away. He seemed to be mentally preparing for the next phase of his life, transitioning from the hidden predator back into the center of a public drama he had once watched with such interest from the back row of a courtroom. In the interrogation room at the regional headquarters, Joachim was surprisingly talkative and cooperative with the detectives. He spoke about his crimes with a chilling sense of professional pride, as if he were describing a successful engineering project to a group of colleagues. He admitted to killing 5 women and attacking several others over the course of 7 years. He confirmed that he had studied the Marchwicki trial with meticulous care, wanting to learn exactly how to avoid the amateur mistakes that had led to the first vampire's capture. He viewed himself as a superior version of the monster that had come before him, a true master of the hunt who had been undone only by a moment of bad luck. He described how he would follow his victims for days, learning the exact rhythm of their lives and identifying the precise moment when they would be most vulnerable to an attack. He used the thick coal dust and the industrial haze of the city as his natural camouflage, knowing that a man in rough work clothes would never be questioned in a town where everyone looked the same. He felt no remorse for the lives he had taken, only a deep sense of regret that he had at last made a mistake that led to his capture. He was a man of total, calculated ego, a predator who saw the world not as a community, but as a series of targets waiting to be struck. Joachim explained the psychology of his double life with a terrifying level of clarity to the investigators. He said that he loved his family and that his role as a father was just as real to him as his role as a killer. He was able to lead a double life because he was a master of compartmentalization, keeping the loving husband and the brutal attacker in 2 completely separate rooms of his mind. He would commit a murder in the early hours of the morning and then return home to make breakfast for his children, never feeling a single moment of guilt or conflict. To him, the violence was a necessary release from the crushing weight of his daily life in the mine. One of the most haunting victims he described was Danuta, a 40-year-old mother who worked at the local bakery. She was a woman of immense warmth, known for giving away extra rolls to the children on their way to school every morning. Danuta lived for her family, spending her weekends tending to a small garden where she grew marigolds and tomatoes. She was walking home from an evening shift in October, the smell of fresh bread still clinging to her coat, when she stepped into the shadow of a brick archway. She was just 5 minutes from her front door, where her husband was already waiting for her with a fresh pot of tea and the news of the day. The atmosphere in Bytom during those long years of the second vampire was one of thick, industrial gloom and constant fear. The street lamps were dim and often flickered out completely, leaving the narrow cobblestone alleys in a state of total, impenetrable darkness. The air was heavy with the smell of burning coal and the metallic tang of the steel mills that ran 24 hours a day. It was a city of early mornings and exhausted evenings, where the population was divided between those who were going down into the earth and those who were coming back up to the surface. This constant movement provided the perfect cover for a man who knew how to wait in the shadows of the brick walls. The police command center was a room filled with heavy cigarette smoke and the frantic, unending ringing of black telephones. Maps of the city were pinned to the walls, covered in hundreds of red pins that marked the locations of the attacks. Every pin was a woman whose life had been shattered, and every string connecting them led back to a central, empty space in the middle of the Bytom industrial district. The investigators were under immense pressure from the Communist Party to resolve the case before the next national holiday. They worked in long, grueling shifts, their eyes red with fatigue, looking for a monster they believed was an outsider, never imagining he was a man who lived just a few blocks away. When the police at last searched Joachim's metal locker at the mine, they found a small wooden box, hidden behind a stack of greasy work manuals and safety guides. Inside was a collection of jewelry and small trinkets that had belonged to his victims. There was a silver ring with a blue stone, a gold locket, and a small, delicate wristwatch that had stopped at the exact time of an attack. These were his trophies, the physical memories of his dominance over the city. He had kept them close to him in the place where he spent his days, a secret hoard of stolen lives buried in the dark heart of the industrial city, just inches away from his unsuspecting colleagues. The trial of Joachim Knychała was a national event that drew thousands of people to the courthouse. He sat in the same room where he had once taken notes, but now he was the one being watched by the cameras and the crowd. He remained defiant throughout the proceedings, often interrupting the judge to correct small details about the locations of the attacks or the timing of his movements. He seemed to enjoy the attention, soaking in the fear and the anger of the crowd as if it were a form of nourishment. He showed no empathy for the families of the victims, treating the trial like a final performance for an audience that at last understood his true power over their lives. The survivors of his attacks also came to the trial, women who still carried the physical and psychological scars of his violence. They spoke of the suddenness of the strikes and the cold, terrifying silence of the man who had ambushed them. Their testimonies were a powerful counterpoint to Joachim's arrogance, revealing the human cost of his borrowed obsession. The courtroom was filled with the sound of weeping as the details of the murders were read aloud. The public's anger was so intense that the authorities had to triple the guard around the courthouse to prevent the crowd from taking justice into their own hands in the streets, where people gathered every morning to scream his name. In the final days of the trial, the prosecution presented the notebook María had found under the floorboards. It was the most damning piece of evidence, showing a mind that was entirely consumed by the mechanics of murder. The notebook contained sketches of the neighborhoods, notes on the patrol routes of the police, and even small drawings of the victims before they were attacked. It was the work of a man who had turned his life into a dark imitation of a nightmare, a person who had voluntarily stepped out of the light and into the deepest shadows of the human psyche. The jury took less than 3 hours to reach their verdict, their decision clear and unanimous after hearing the evidence. Joachim Knychała was found guilty on all counts of murder and attempted murder. He was sentenced to death by hanging, the maximum penalty allowed under Polish law at the time. He did not flinch when the sentence was read, and he did not look at his wife or children for the last time. He was led out of the courtroom in heavy chains, his head held high as he passed through the rows of people who had once been his neighbors. He was a man who had chosen to be a monster, and he seemed to accept the consequences with the same cold, analytical detachment that had defined his entire life in the mines of Bytom, never showing a single moment of weakness. The execution was carried out in 1990, just as the political landscape of Poland was beginning to change forever. The communist regime was falling, and the laws of the country were being rewritten for a new era of democracy. Joachim was one of the last people to be executed before the abolition of the death penalty. He died in a prison in Krakow, far away from the coal mines and the streets he had terrorized for so long. His death marked the end of a dark chapter in Silesian history, a period defined by two vampires who had used the industrial gloom to hide their crimes. The silence that followed was long and heavy, a weight that stayed with the city. Standing amidst the clean glass and steel of the modern city today, the execution of Joachim Knychała is still remembered as a landmark in the study of serial killers in Eastern Europe. Poland has since moved toward a more restorative justice system, but the memory of the Bytom murders remains a source of trauma for the older generation who lived through those years. The archives of the case are now open to researchers, providing a rare look into the mind of a copycat killer who sought to surpass his idol. The story is a cautionary tale about the power of obsession and the way that violence can be learned and refined by those who are willing to watch and take notes in the dark, hidden in plain sight. Modern DNA technology has recently allowed the Bytom police to revisit several cold cases from the late 1970s that were never solved. As of 2026, forensic scientists have linked Joachim to 3 more attacks that were not part of his original confession. This new evidence has brought a sense of closure to families who had lived for decades with the uncertainty of what had happened to their loved ones. The files have been officially closed, adding more names to the list of those who were touched by the darkness of the second vampire. The industrial city continues to unearth the secrets of its violent past, piece by piece, as the years move forward. The apartment building where Joachim lived with his family was demolished in the early 2000s to make way for a new development. Today, a modern shopping center and a bright, well-lit park stand where the locker rooms in the dark alleys once were. The coal mines have mostly closed, and the gray soot that once covered everything has been replaced by green spaces and clean glass. But for those who remember the late 70s, the city still holds a certain chill. They still tell their children to stay in the light and to never talk to strangers, even if they look like a friendly neighbor helping with the groceries on a Tuesday afternoon. The locker at the Dimitro mine was never used again after Joachim's arrest. It was welded shut and eventually removed when the facility was decommissioned years later. The workers who followed him spoke of a strange coldness in that corner of the room, a feeling of being watched by someone who wasn't there. The story of the wrench and the notebook became a part of the local folklore, a warning about the man who worked beside you for 8 hours a day without ever revealing the monster inside. The industrial heart of Poland has moved on, but it has not forgotten the price it paid for the silence of a model worker who spent his nights hunting his own neighbors. María Knychała and her children disappeared from public life after the execution, moving to a different part of the country and changing their names to escape the shadow of the vampire. Now that the city's shadows have been permanently erased by light, it is reported that she lived a quiet, secluded life, never speaking about her husband to the media or the police. Her children grew up without the knowledge of their father's true nature until they were adults, a secret that María held close to her heart to protect them from the poison of his legacy. They are the hidden victims of Joachim's obsession, the ones who had to build a life on a foundation of lies and darkness, away from the prying eyes of the world. I think about the fact that Joachim's notebook was essentially a manual for his own destruction. He spent so much time learning how to be a killer that he eventually forgot how to be a human being, losing the very family he claimed to love and provide for. He was a man who became a slave to a borrowed identity, a person who had no original darkness of his own and had to steal it from another. The final entry in his notebook was a single date, the day he was caught, written in a shaky, uncharacteristically messy hand. It was the only time his discipline failed him, a small crack in the armor of a man who thought he was a machine. The heavy coal dust of Bytom eventually settled, covering the memory of the courtroom notebook in a layer of gray silence that lasted for decades. But as we move from the industrial heart of Poland to the darkened streets of Bucharest, Romania, we find a city where the shadows were not made of soot, but of a total, systemic collapse. There, the killer did not need a notebook to hide. He only needed the lights to go out and the fear of a revolution to mask his footsteps. We move now from the trial of the vampire to the shifting, blacked-out sidewalks of a city in the middle of a violent transition, where the rules were being rewritten every night. October 8, 1991. Bucharest. A young woman named Elena walked through the Sector 1 district, her heels clicking against the cracked pavement. The air was thick with the scent of diesel and cheap coal, a lingering fog that seemed to settle into the very pores of the buildings. It was barely 7 in the evening, but in a city struggling to find its footing after a violent revolution, the night arrived early and stayed late. Elena tightened the belt of her trench coat, her eyes scanning the long, unlit stretch of the sidewalk ahead. Elena was 22 years old and a student of architecture at the university nearby. She had grown up under the heavy weight of the old regime, and she viewed the city not as a series of obstacles, but as a blueprint for a future she hoped to build herself. She spent her days in the campus library, surrounded by the smell of dust and old paper, sketching grand visions of glass and light. She wanted to replace the gray, brutalist blocks of the past with something that breathed and moved. Her life was a careful balance of academic ambition and the daily exhausting grind of a country in transition. She lived in a small, third-floor apartment with her grandmother, who still saved every piece of string and every glass jar as if the food shortages might return at any hour. Elena's room was filled with rolls of drafting paper and a single, cherished lamp that she used when the electricity was working. She was a woman who appreciated order and precision. Every morning, she would carefully polish her shoes and brush her hair, maintaining a sense of dignity that the crumbling infrastructure of Bucharest tried to strip away. To her, the chaos of the city was a temporary state that could be managed through discipline. The streets of Bucharest in 1991 were a landscape of uncertainty. The old secret police had been disbanded, but the new authorities were disorganized and often absent. The street lamps were frequently dark, either due to power cuts or because the bulbs had been stolen and never replaced. People moved through the neighborhoods in groups, their faces hidden by scarves, speaking in hushed tones about the rising price of bread and the latest rumors from the parliament. It was a time when the rules of the past had vanished, but the safety of the new world had not yet been established for the ordinary citizen. Elena's daily walk home took her past the massive, unfinished shell of the House of the People, a building that loomed over the city like a silent, white ghost. She would often pause for a moment to look at the scaffolding, thinking about the thousands of laborers who had worked there under the old dictator. To her, the building was a monument to a silence that had lasted for decades. She preferred to take the side streets, where the old villas of the pre-war era still stood, their ornate balconies dripping with ivy and the memory of a more elegant, more predictable time in the city. One afternoon, while Elena was buying a small bag of apples at the local market, she heard the women whispering about a shadow that was moving through the darkened Sector 1. They spoke about a woman who had been found in a hallway, her spirit broken and her face bruised by a man who had come from the blackness without a word. They mentioned the name Ion Rimaru, the infamous killer from 20 years earlier who had terrorized the capital. The suggestion was that a copycat was now using the city's frequent blackouts to hunt in the same way, targeting those who walked alone through the blackout streets. Elena dismissed the talk as the kind of urban legend that thrives in times of social upheaval. She believed that the fear was a leftover from the old days, a ghost of the paranoia that had once defined life in Romania. She continued her routine, trusting in her own knowledge of the shortcuts and the timing of the power outages. She felt that, as long as she stayed alert and moved with purpose, she was invisible to the dangers that the older women described. She was a woman of logic and stone, not a person who believed in shadows or the echoes of a dead serial killer from the past. On the evening of October 15th, the city was plunged into a scheduled power outage that lasted much longer than usual. The entire district went black at 6:30, leaving only the dim orange glow of wood fires and the flickering of candles in apartment windows. Elena was still at the library when the lights went out, the sudden silence of the building making her heart skip a beat. She gathered her drawings in the dark, feeling the familiar texture of the paper beneath her fingers. She knew the path home by heart, and she told herself that the darkness was simply a different kind of architecture. As she stepped out into the street, the cold air hit her face like a damp cloth. The only light came from the moon, which was a pale, thin sliver behind the heavy clouds. The city felt different in total darkness. The distances seemed to stretch, and the familiar landmarks were reduced to jagged, unrecognizable silhouettes. Elena started walking, her footsteps muffled by the layer of wet leaves on the ground. She stayed close to the walls of the buildings, her hand occasionally brushing against the cold, rough stone as she navigated the corners. The silence was absolute, a heavy weight that pressed against her ears. She reached a small plaza where a single, broken street lamp was swinging rhythmically in the wind. The metal arm of the lamp groaned with every movement, a sound that felt like a low, mechanical moan. As she passed beneath it, Elena felt a sudden, sharp prickle of unease at the base of her neck. She stopped and listened, but the only sound was the wind and the groan of the metal. She turned her head slightly, looking back toward the shadows she had just left. For a fleeting second, she thought she saw a shape moving behind a row of parked cars, a figure that was darker than the night around it. She quickened her pace, her breathing becoming shallow and fast. The clicks of her heels on the pavement sounded like gunshots in the quiet street. She turned onto a narrow alleyway that served as a shortcut to her apartment block, her eyes straining to see the end of the corridor. The alley was a tunnel of blackness, the walls closing in on either side. Halfway through, she heard a sound that made her freeze. It was the distinct, rhythmic scuff of a heavy boot on the stone, exactly 3 paces behind her. Someone was matching her stride, their movement perfectly synchronized with hers to hide their presence. Elena did not run. She knew that if she ran, she would lose her footing on the uneven ground and expose herself as prey. She reached into her bag and felt for her heavy drafting compass, the metal points sharp against her palm. She continued to walk, her eyes fixed on the distant light of a candle in a window at the end of the alley. The footsteps behind her grew closer, the scuffing sound replaced by the heavy, deliberate breathing of a man who was now just inches away. She could smell the scent of stale tobacco and the metallic tang of wet wool. The shadow was no longer a legend. The investigation into the Bucharest attacks had been struggling for months. The local police, many of whom were former members of the communist militia, were viewed with deep distrust by the public. They had no modern forensic equipment and no centralized database to track the movements of the suspect. The lead investigator, a man named Colonel Vasilescu, spent his nights driving through the darkened streets in a battered Dacia, looking for any sign of a disturbance. He was a man who understood that the city was a maze of hidden history, and that the killer was likely someone who had been shaped by the violence of the revolution. Vasilescu found that the victims were all women who worked late in the city's essential services, nurses, teachers, and students. He noticed that the attacks always occurred in areas where the infrastructure had failed most spectacularly. The killer was not just a predator, he was an opportunist who used the city's decay as his primary weapon. The colonel realized that the lack of streetlights was not just a logistical problem, it was a psychological shield for a man who wanted to return the city to a state of primal fear. He began to organize patrols of plainclothes officers, placing them in the most vulnerable sectors of the capital. The twist in the search came when a witness, a young boy who lived in a basement apartment, reported seeing a man in an old gray security uniform moving through the shadows. The uniform was of the type worn by the guards at the state-run factories that were now being closed down. This suggested that the killer was not a ghost or a copycat, but a man who had been discarded by the old system and was now seeking a sense of power in the ruins of his former life. He was a man who felt invisible in the light and only truly existed when the power was turned off and the city went black. Elena reached the end of the alley and burst into the small courtyard of her apartment block. She turned around, her heart hammering against her ribs, and saw a man standing in the mouth of the tunnel. He was tall and thin, his face hidden by a peaked cap and the deep shadows of his collar. He didn't move toward her. He just stood there, watching her with a stillness that was more terrifying than a shout. He stayed for exactly 10 seconds before stepping back into the blackness of the alley and vanishing. Elena ran up the stairs to her apartment, her hands shaking so hard she could barely turn the key in the lock. The next night, the residents of the Sector 1 district took to the streets themselves. Frustrated by the police's inability to catch the shadow, groups of men armed themselves with heavy wooden clubs and metal pipes, patrolling the courtyards and the alleys. They were driven by a collective anger and the memory of the children who had been hurt. The city felt like it was on the verge of another revolution, the tension between the people and the invisible predator reaching a breaking point. Every sound in the dark was met with a shout, and every stranger was questioned with a level of intensity that the police could never match. The capture of the suspect happened by pure chance on a rainy Tuesday in November. A group of neighbors in a nearby district heard a woman scream near an old fountain. They did not wait for the police. They ran toward the sound, their flashlights cutting through the mist. They found a man in a gray coat trying to pull a woman into a dark basement entry. The men tackled him to the ground, holding him down with the weight of their collective fury. When the police arrived, they found a man who looked completely ordinary, a person who would have been ignored in any crowd during the daylight hours of the city. The man was a 40-year-old former factory guard who had lost his job and his apartment after the revolution. During his interrogation, he spoke about the city as if it were a place that had betrayed him. He admitted that he had been obsessed with the stories of Ion Rimaru since he was a teenager, viewing the killer not as a monster, but as a person who had truly mastered the streets of Bucharest. He claimed that the darkness made him feel like he was back in control, a person whose presence mattered in a world that had otherwise forgotten he existed. He was a man of total, bitter resentment. I find it striking that the killer believed he was reviving a legacy, but in reality, he was just a symptom of a broken city's inability to care for its own. He did not have the intelligence or the planning of his idol. He only had the advantage of a crumbling infrastructure and the collective trauma of a nation in transition. He was a predator of opportunity, a man who had turned his personal failure into a campaign of terror against those who were trying to build a new life. He was the literal manifestation of the shadows that the old regime had left behind in the hearts of its citizens. The legal outcome was a quiet affair compared to the chaos of the streets. The man was convicted of multiple counts of assault and attempted murder, receiving a long sentence in a high-security prison on the outskirts of the capital. The case forced the new government to prioritize the restoration of the city's streetlights and the reorganization of the police force. The Bucharest shadow was a dark landmark that marked the end of the wild post-revolutionary era. It was the moment the city realized that freedom required the light of security and the accountability of the law to survive the long nights of winter. Today, the Sector 1 district has been fully transformed. The cracked pavements have been replaced with smooth stone, and the alleyways are now lined with bright LED lamps and the outdoor seating of quiet cafes. The gray, brutalist blocks are still there, but they are now covered in vibrant murals and the light of a new generation. The House of the People, once a white ghost, is now the Palace of the Parliament, a major tourist destination that is brightly lit every evening. The city has found its footing, and the silence of the old days has been replaced by the hum of a modern European capital. Elena did become an architect, and she helped design some of the very lighting systems that now keep the city safe. She still lives in Bucharest, and she still walks home after dark, but she no longer carries a drafting compass in her hand. She looks at the street lamps not just as functional objects, but as the pillars of the peace she worked so hard to establish. To her, the darkness is no longer an architecture of fear. It is simply the space between the lights where the city breathes. The shadows have been pushed back, but the memory of the year of the shadow remains a part of the city's hidden history. The pylon of the old street lamp that once groaned in the wind was removed years ago, replaced by a sleek, modern fixture that never flickers. The fountain where the killer was caught is now a site of quiet reflection, surrounded by flowers and the laughter of children playing in the sun. The story of the Bucharest shadow is told as a cautionary tale to the young architects of the university, a reminder that the safety of a city is built not just from stone and glass, but from the light we choose to keep alive in the dark. The transition is complete, and the city finally belongs to the living. The shadows in the streets of Bucharest were a product of a failing infrastructure and a broken system, a darkness that could be solved with a bulb and a wire. But as we move from the cobblestones of Romania to the elegant gated parties of Catamarca, Argentina, we find a different kind of darkness. It was not caused by a lack of light, but by an excess of power. It was the story of a girl who went to a party and never came home, and the town that had to break its own silence to find the truth. We move now from the swinging street lamp to the white headscarf of a marching nun. September 7th, 1990, Catamarca, Argentina. María Soledad Morales stood in front of her bedroom mirror, smoothing the fabric of her dress for a night out with her classmates. The air in the small provincial capital was warm, carrying the scent of blooming jasmine and the dry dust of the surrounding mountains. She was 17 years old, a girl with a shy smile and long, dark hair that she spent hours brushing until it shone like silk under the dim light of her room. Maria was the kind of daughter who made her parents, Elias and Ada, feel a constant sense of quiet pride. She was a student at the Carmen de Lucci School, where she was known for her kindness and her habit of helping younger students with their homework. She wasn't a girl who chased trouble. She was a girl who dreamed of her upcoming graduation and the career in nursing she hoped to start in the city. Her life was a simple, happy collection of school books, family dinners, and laughter shared with a small, loyal group of friends. In her small bedroom, Maria kept a collection of dried flowers and old movie tickets, small souvenirs of a life that was just beginning to open up. She was the middle child, a bridge between her older and younger siblings, often acting as the peacemaker during family arguments. She loved the quiet afternoons in Catamarca when the sun turned the sandstone buildings a deep orange and the rhythm of the town slowed down for a siesta. To her, the future felt like a wide, paved road that led exactly where she wanted to go. She spent a lot of time helping her mother in the kitchen, learning the family recipes for empanadas and fresh bread. Maria was a girl of steady habits, someone who always remembered to kiss her father on the cheek before she left the house. Her friends described her as the heart of their group, the one who always knew how to listen and when to offer a hand. She was the type of person who planned for weeks for a single party, wanting everything to be perfect for her final year of high school. Catamarca was a place where everyone believed they knew their neighbors. It was a conservative, religious town where the church bells dictated the flow of the day and the local politicians were treated like royalty. The Morales family lived on the outskirts, away from the grand villas and the gated parties of the elite. They were hard-working people who believed that if you followed the rules and respected the authorities, the world would treat you fairly. María grew up with a deep sense of trust in the institutions of her town. That Friday night, Maria's school was holding a fundraiser at a local discotheque called La Fe. The goal was to raise money for their senior trip, a tradition that every student in Argentina looked forward to for years. She had saved her allowance to buy a new outfit, and she felt a rare sense of excitement as she stepped out of her house. She promised her mother she would be home by 3 a.m, a curfew that she had never broken before. She walked toward the center of town, her heels clicking on the pavement. The party was loud and filled with the energy of nearly 200 teenagers celebrating the end of the week. María was seen dancing with her friends, laughing and talking as the music filled the dark, crowded room. She seemed completely at ease, a girl enjoying a rare night of freedom from her studies. But as the clock moved toward midnight, the atmosphere in the club began to shift. A group of older men arrived, people who didn't belong at a school fundraiser. They were the children of the local political elite, known in town as the Children of Power. Witnesses would later recall seeing María talking to a man named Luis Tula, an older individual she had been seeing in secret. Tula was a man who moved in circles far beyond Maria's simple world. As the night progressed, María was seen leaving the club with him, stepping into the cool night air. She believed she was going to another small gathering, a private party at a villa owned by one of the town's prominent families. It was the last time any of her school friends would see her alive, standing under the bright neon lights of the plaza. Monday morning, September 10th. 2 road workers were driving along Route 38, just a few miles outside the city center. The sun was rising over the mountains, casting long shadows across the dry scrubland. They noticed something unusual in a ditch near the edge of the asphalt. At first, they thought it was a discarded mannequin or a pile of old clothes. As they stepped closer, the smell of the damp earth was replaced by something sharp and metallic. They found the remains of a young woman, partially hidden by the tall grass and the shadows of the embankment. The discovery was reported to the local police, but the initial response was strangely slow. When the officers finally arrived, they did not cordon off the area. They did not take photographs of the footprints in the dirt or look for tire tracks. Instead, they moved the body almost immediately, washing it at the local morgue before a proper forensic exam could be conducted. I noticed that the site was cleaned of all physical evidence within hours, as if someone was trying to erase the very fact that a crime had occurred in that specific spot of the highway. The news of Maria's death hit Catamarca like a physical blow. The town was small enough that everyone felt the loss, but the grief was quickly joined by a rising sense of suspicion. The initial police report claimed that María had died of an overdose and that her body had been left by the road by panicked friends. But her family knew this was a lie. María didn't use drugs, and the bruises on her body told a story of a violent struggle, not a quiet, accidental death. The silence from the authorities began to feel like a heavy, suffocating weight. Elias Morales, a man of few words and deep faith, refused to let the case be buried. He walked to the local police station every day, asking for updates that never came. He was met with cold stares and vague promises. He realized that the people who were supposed to find the killer were the same people who were protecting the families of the suspects. The investigation was being blocked at every level by a system of corruption that reached into the governor's mansion. The Morales family was being told to mourn in silence and move on. In the center of this silence stood Sister Martha Pelloni, the principal of Maria's school. She was a woman of fierce conviction who refused to watch her student be forgotten by a corrupt system. She realized that the only way to find justice was to break the silence of the town. She organized a march, asking the students and their parents to walk with her through the streets of Catamarca. She told them not to shout or carry signs with angry slogans. She asked them to walk in absolute, heavy silence, wearing white headscarves as a symbol of their demand for the truth. The first march was small, but it grew every week. Soon, thousands of people were walking through the center of Catamarca every Thursday afternoon. The only sound was the rhythmic shuffling of feet on the pavement. The silent marches became a national phenomenon, a peaceful but powerful challenge to the sons of power. The white headscarves moved through the town like a slow, unstoppable tide of accountability. The elite families watched from their balconies, their curtains drawn, realizing that the fear they had used to control the town was being replaced by a collective, quiet courage. The pressure from the marches eventually forced the federal government in Buenos Aires to intervene. They sent in special investigators who were not tied to the local political families. They discovered that the local police had actively participated in a cover-up. It found evidence that María had been taken to a party where she was drugged, raped, and eventually killed. Her body had been kept in a cold storage facility for 2 days before being dumped on the highway. The washing of the body at the morgue had been a deliberate attempt to destroy DNA evidence of the perpetrators. The twist in the case came when a witness finally stepped forward, a man who had been a servant at the villa where the party took place. He described seeing Guillermo Luque, the son of a powerful local congressman, at the scene. He described how the young men had treated María like an object, a toy for their amusement. He revealed that the local government had used its resources to hide Luque in another province, while the local police fabricated the overdose story. The sons of power believed they were untouchable because their fathers owned the law in Catamarca. The investigation revealed a culture of absolute entitlement. The elite youth of the town had spent years operating without consequences, protected by a system that valued political loyalty over human life. They viewed the daughters of the working class as disposable, believing that their family names could buy their way out of any tragedy. The murder of María Soledad was not an isolated event. It was the inevitable result of a society where power had been allowed to rot. The silent marches had finally exposed the skeletal remains of a system that was built on the suffering of the many. The climax of the legal battle was the first televised trial in the history of Argentina. The entire country watched as the evidence was presented, showing the direct link between the political elite and the brutal death of a 17-year-old girl. The defense tried to attack Maria's character, suggesting she was a party girl who had brought the tragedy on herself. But the image of the silent, marching thousands was more powerful than the lies of the lawyers. The trial became a referendum on the nature of justice in a country that was still recovering from a long history of military dictatorship. Guillermo Luque was eventually sentenced to 21 years in prison for the murder. Luis Tula, the man who had lured her from the club, was sentenced to 9 years for his role as an accomplice. The provincial government of Catamarca collapsed under the weight of the scandal, with federal authorities removing the governor from office. The Morales family had achieved what seemed impossible. They had brought down a dynasty using nothing but the truth and the sound of silent footsteps. But the victory felt hollow in the quiet rooms of their home, where Maria's bed remained empty and unmade. The truth was that María had been given a lethal dose of cocaine, a substance she had never seen before, to make her easier to control. When her heart began to fail under the stress of the assault, the men did not call for help. They watched her die, then called their fathers to clean up the mess. They treated her final moments like a logistical problem to be solved with a phone call and a mop. The coldness of the act was a reflection of a world where the life of a schoolgirl was worth less than the reputation of a congressman's son. Guillermo Luque was a man of immense arrogance who never expressed a single word of remorse. He believed he was a victim of a political conspiracy, a prince who had been unfairly cast down by the masses. His profile was that of a classic narcissist, a person who had been raised in a bubble of protection and privilege that blinded him to the humanity of others. Luis Tula was a predator of a different kind, a man who used his social connections to hunt for victims among those who were looking for a way out of their small, predictable lives. When the wind still blows through the tall grasses on that lonely hill, the case of María Soledad Morales is taught in every law school in Argentina as the foundational moment for María Soledad's law, which created stricter penalties for institutional cover-ups. The anniversary of her death is marked nationally as a day against femicide and institutional violence. Guillermo Luque was released on parole several years ago after serving his sentence, but he remains a pariah in the country, living in isolation. Luis Tula also completed his sentence and disappeared from public life, his name forever tied to the night he stepped out of the neon lights. Elias Morales passed away in 2016, having spent the final decades of his life as a symbol of quiet, unwavering integrity. His wife, Ada, still lives in Catamarca, where she continues to support the families of other victims of violence. The town has changed. The political family that once ruled with an iron hand is no longer in power, and the silence of Catamarca is now a silence of peace rather than a silence of fear. The white headscarves are kept in a small museum, a reminder of the power of a town that refused to look away from the truth. The white cloth of the headscarves moved in the wind like a long, pale ghost, a material sign of a community that had at last found its voice. But as we move from the mountains of Argentina to the rolling hills of Gatalila in Kenya, we find a different kind of white cloth. It was not a headscarf of a marching nun, but a single white sports shoe left neatly on the charred grass. It belonged to a man who had tried to fight corruption from the inside, only to find that some fires cannot be extinguished by the truth alone. We move now from the marches of Catamarca to the lonely hills of Kenya. February 13th, 1990. Koru, Kenya. Robert Oko sat at the wooden desk in his study, the yellow light of a small lamp reflecting off his glasses. Outside, the night was thick and silent, broken only by the chirping of crickets in the tall grass. He was the foreign minister of Kenya, a man who moved between the world's great capitals, but tonight he was just a man in his own home, surrounded by the familiar scent of old books and floor wax. Robert was 60 years old and had spent his life navigating the complex waters of international diplomacy. He was known for his sharp suits and his even sharper mind, a person who could speak 3 languages with perfect fluency. He had a reputation for being a bridge builder, someone who could find common ground even in the most heated of disputes. In his village, he was respected as a man who had not forgotten his roots despite his high station in the government. He was a devoted father and husband, cherishing the quiet weekends he could spend at his farmhouse in Koru. He loved walking through the citrus groves he had planted himself, checking the ripening fruit with the same attention to detail he gave to a diplomatic treaty. To Robert, the land was a source of stability in a career that was often defined by shifting alliances and political pressure. He was a man who valued integrity above all else, a rare trait in the cabinet. His home in Koru was a place of relative peace. He spent his mornings reading international newspapers and his evenings listening to classical music on a small record player. He was a man of discipline, waking up at 5 every morning to go for a brisk walk before the heat of the sun became too intense. He enjoyed the simple conversations with local farmers, discussing the rains and the price of maize. He was a man who believed that the government should serve the people. Robert had recently returned from a high-profile trip to Washington, D.C., where he had met with world leaders to discuss the future of the Kenyan economy. He was optimistic about the potential for growth, but he was also deeply concerned about reports of corruption he had discovered regarding a massive sugar factory project. He was a man who could not look away from a problem once he had identified it. He had spent the last few days compiling a dossier of his findings. His wife, Christabel, remembered him as a man who never brought the stress of his work into the home. He would leave his briefcase by the door and transition into the role of a father with a seamless, quiet grace. He was particularly close to his youngest daughter, often helping her with her studies and encouraging her to think for herself. He wanted his children to grow up in a country where merit mattered more than connections. He believed in the slow progress of his nation. Robert was a man of deep faith, attending the local church every Sunday and often participating in community projects to improve the schools. He did not use his position to gain special favors. He stood in line like everyone else and paid his taxes with a meticulous honesty. He was a man who lived by a code that was becoming increasingly rare in the circles he frequented. He felt a sense of duty to protect the resources of his country for the next generation of citizens. The evening of February 12th had been unremarkable. He had eaten dinner with his family and then retreated to his study to finish a final report. He told his bodyguards that he would not be needing them for the rest of the night, as he planned to work late into the morning. The house was locked and the gates were closed. He was a man in his prime, a person who felt secure in his own skin and in the safety of his home. He turned off the lamp at midnight, and the house fell dark. At approximately 3 in the morning, a white car was seen idling near the gates of the Koru farmhouse. There was no sound of a struggle, and no alarm was raised. The domestic staff later reported hearing a soft metallic click, as if a door was being closed very quietly. A single flashlight beam was seen moving through the citrus groves for a few seconds before vanishing into the night. By the time the sun began to rise over the hills, the mysterious white car was gone. When the house help went to serve Robert his morning tea, they found his bedroom door wide open. His bed was neatly made, and his glasses were still resting on the nightstand beside a half-read book. His favorite white sports shoes were missing from the closet, along with a small leather bag he used for travel. There was no sign of a forced entry and no evidence of a struggle. The foreign minister had simply vanished from the center of his own home without a sound. 3 days later, a young herdsboy was moving his cattle across the slopes of Gat Alila Hill, just a few miles from the Koru farm. The air was dry and the grass was brittle from the lack of rain. He noticed a dark, charred patch of ground near a cluster of acacia trees. As he moved closer, he saw a shape that did not belong to the landscape. He found the remains of a man, lying face down in the dirt. The silence of the hill was absolute as he stood over the discovery. Beside the body, sitting neatly on the grass as if they had been placed there for a specific purpose, were several items. There was a single white sports shoe, a small flashlight, a plastic jerry can, and a simple kitchen matchbox. These objects were untouched by the fire that had scorched the earth around the body. The discovery was reported to the local police, and the news that the foreign minister had been found dead sent a wave of shock through the entire country. The initial government report was released within 24 hours. It claimed that Robert Uko had committed suicide. They suggested that he had walked several miles to the hill in the middle of the night, doused himself in kerosene, and set himself on fire. The official statement described him as a man under immense personal stress who had decided to end his own life in a remote location, but the public did not believe the story. The details of the scene did not fit the man. A forensic examination conducted by independent pathologists revealed a much different story. Robert's leg had been broken before he died, and there was a single bullet hole in the back of his head. There was no soot in his lungs. meaning he was already dead before the fire was started. The suicide theory was a physical impossibility. The investigation became a hunt for the truth in a country where the truth was often a dangerous thing to hold. The atmosphere was thick. Scotland Yard detectives were eventually brought in from London to lead an independent inquiry. They were led by John Troon, a man of immense experience who was used to dealing with complex political crimes. Troon and his team spent months in Kenya, interviewing witnesses and examining the evidence. They found that their work was being blocked at every turn by high-ranking officials. Files went missing, witnesses were intimidated, and the detectives were followed. Despite the interference, Troon managed to piece together a narrative of what had happened in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. He discovered that Robert had been in a series of heated arguments with other cabinet ministers over the sugar factory project. Robert had been preparing a detailed report on the corruption he had uncovered, a report that would have implicated the most powerful people in the country. He was a man who had become a direct threat to the elite. The detectives found that the white car seen at the gates of the farmhouse belonged to a government department. They traced the movements of the vehicle on the night of the disappearance, finding that it had been seen near the Gadalila Hill just before dawn. The items found at the scene, the shoe and the matchbox, were identified as plants intended to support the suicide narrative. The killer had been careful to stage the scene, but they had underestimated the experts. The twist in the investigation came when a witness who had been hiding in the shadows of the Koru farm finally spoke out. He described seeing a group of men entering the house using a key. They did not break in. They walked in like they owned the place. He recognized one of the men as a high-ranking security official close to the presidency. This confirmed that the abduction was not the work of a random gang, but a state-sponsored operation carried out with official clearance. This witness also revealed that Robert had been taken to a different location before his body was moved to the hill. He had been interrogated for hours, his captors demanding to know where he had hidden the copies of his corruption report. Robert had refused to speak, holding on to his integrity until the very end. The broken leg was a result of the torture he endured. The decision to kill him was made only when it became clear that he would never stop his investigation. The climax of the case was the release of the Troon report. It named several high-ranking officials as the primary suspects in the murder. The report described a conspiracy that reached into the inner circle of the government. The people of Kenya took to the streets, demanding justice and the arrest of those named in the document. The government responded with a series of public inquiries that were designed to stall the process and confuse the public. The tension was extreme. The suspects were briefly detained, but they were released within weeks due to a lack of evidence. The legal system was still firmly under the control of the same people who had orchestrated the crime. The Troon report was shelved, and the investigation was effectively shut down. The man who had tried to save his country from corruption was buried in a quiet ceremony, while the people who had killed him remained in their positions, their influence unchanged by the scandal. The truth of the Robert Uko case is a story of a system that protected itself by destroying anyone who dared to challenge it. He was killed because he refused to be part of a culture of silence. The project he was investigating was worth millions of dollars, and the people involved were willing to commit murder to keep their secrets. The fire on the hill was intended to erase the evidence, but it instead became a beacon that illuminated the rot at the heart of the government. The objects found on the hill, the shoe and the matchbox, were intended to be the final words of the story, but they became the first clues in a long and painful search for justice. They represented the arrogance of power, the belief that a life could be neatly packaged and discarded like a piece of trash. Robert was a man of high ideals, who was brought down by the lowest form of greed. He died alone on a silent hill, but his death changed the way an entire nation viewed itself. The individuals named as suspects were men of immense influence, veterans of the political scene who understood how to move in the shadows. They viewed the law as a tool to be used for their own benefit, and they viewed their opponents as obstacles to be removed. They were highly organized and possessed the resources of the state to hide their tracks. They were men who had traded their own humanity for a seat at the table of power, and they felt no remorse for the life taken. In 2026, the case of Robert Oko remains officially unsolved. No one has ever been convicted of his murder, and most of the primary suspects from the 1990 era have passed away. The files are still open in the archives of the Kenyan police, but they are rarely touched. The Oko case is taught in universities as a primary example of institutional failure and the culture of impunity. The farm in Koru still stands, a quiet place that holds his memory. I think about that single white sports shoe sitting on the grass of Gadalila, a small, mundane object that was meant to be a lie but ended up being the truth. It represents the persistence of a man's identity, even in the face of absolute destruction. Robert Oko was a man of integrity who was silenced by the dark, but his story remains a part of the conscience of a nation. The fire on the hill has long since gone out, but the light of the investigation continues to flicker. The shoe remained on the hillside for days, a final, silent mark of a man who was there one moment and gone the next. As the wind moves through the tall grass of Gadalila, it carries the echo of a life lived with purpose and ended in shadows. The hills remain quiet, holding the secrets of the night in 1990. We leave the slopes of Kenya now, returning to the silence of the room where the rain continues to fall against the glass.